Right, good morning. My name is John Mason. I'm the Vice Convener of the committee, and we're not entirely sure what has happened to the convener this morning, so my apologies that we're starting just a few minutes late. But we will start, and I will be in the chair in the meantime, and when Kenneth Gibson turns up, he will take over the chair. So welcome, good morning, and welcome to the 22nd meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee. Can I just ask everyone present to turn off mobile phones, tablets, electronic devices, or anything else that would make a noise. We have received apologies today from Jean Urquhart. So item 1 on the agenda is a decision to take business in private. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed on that? Agreed. Thank you. We'll then move to item 2, which is our examination of the Children and Young People Scotland Bill. Now, the committee is going to take evidence from 3 witnesses in our first panel. Our second item of business today is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny of the Children and Young People Scotland's Bill Financial Memorandum. We will hear from 2 panels of witnesses, followed by, I think, the Bill team, who submitted written evidence to the committee, and then we'll put questions to Scottish Government officials. If any of the participants would like to respond to a question or make a point, please indicate that to me or to the clerk. So can I welcome to the meeting, I think in not necessarily the order they're sitting in, Alistair Gaw from Edinburgh City of Edinburgh Council, Magnus Ingalls from Midlothian Council, and Innes Murray from National Day Nurseries Association. So the process is that the committee members will ask questions, and we're aiming for about 1 hour for this session, is that correct? Okay, so let's begin, and normally the convener starts, but I think for a change today we'll start with some of the members of the committee. So Malcolm, you go first.
There's several interesting aspects of this bill, obviously from both a policy and a financial point of view. If I could start with the kinship care arrangements, I noticed that was one of the main concerns, probably the main concern, in fact, from the City of Edinburgh Council submission. And obviously, there's quite a complex policy change underlying that. So I wondered if the City of Edinburgh Council could, and the others obviously, but I know it was highlighted by the City of Edinburgh Council, could explain the basis of their concerns. I think it's mainly you're sceptical about the potential savings that would result from the kinship care changes. It would be helpful if you could, and perhaps others, start by explaining that.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. We obviously support kinship care whenever a child needs to live with alternative carers. If parents can't care for a child, the first port of call is always the extended family. There are a number of ways in which these arrangements are made, and very often they don't involve the local authority at all. But nevertheless, when the local authority is involved, and in particular where a child is looked after with a kinship carer, then there are substantial duties and financial commitments that the local authority makes to those children. I think the concerns that we expressed in our evidence were really based on the fact that the assumptions of the potential savings that could be made, the avoided costs in the memorandum in table 28, are, we think, very exaggerated, and we also think that there's potentially additional costs because we think the estimate in the memorandum that between only 1.5 and 3.5% of informal kinship carers will come forward for a new order is an underestimate. That's based on our experience and on the numbers that we have at the moment. So basically, the conclusion to that is that there's a great deal of financial risk at the moment on local authorities, and certainly from the City of Edinburgh Council's perspective, our council, from the proposals as they currently stand, we don't yet think that this element of the bill is funded. I know it's the government's intent to fully fund the bill, but in respect of kinship care, we don't think that's the position at the moment, and we obviously, consistent with the COSLA position, would want to make sure that as the bill goes forward, that we get the opportunity to make sure that the funding for these measures is actually realistic. There are a number of unknowns at the moment in relation to the pressures in local authorities around kinship care. Part of it stems from the modelling around the numbers, which isn't consistent with our experience. But secondly, there's also the impact of welfare reform across the UK, which could have potential impact on benefits available to carers. And thirdly, the position in respect of so welfare reform is the second. The other issue relates to I'm sorry, it's gone for a second. I'll come back to that one. But certainly for us, we don't think that the estimates that are currently in the bill are consistent with our own experience. To conclude, perhaps, and allow some questions, I'll give one example of that. The overall avoided costs are based on figures from 2007 to 2011 for the growth of kinship carers in Scotland, which was 87%. There's a growth of 87% of looked after children in kinship care. In the City of Edinburgh, that growth was only 29%. So the avoided costs that are in the bill, in the memorandum, are nothing like those that we would avoid because the model is based on a false premise.
The avoided costs, avoiding them becoming looked after children, is the idea that the kinship care order will cost less than the looked after children arrangement? Is that what the savings are based on?
That's right. There's an assumption being made that currently many of the families who are currently have a child who's looked after with kinship carers will seek to have the new kinship care order, which is a variation on the Section 11 order. It's a private law measure. But that order has to be made attractive to families. But at the moment, there's no evidence that it will be particularly attractive to them. So we don't think that there's robust evidence that families will actually move from a position where their child is looked after and they get a set of resources behind that to a position where they're on the new kinship care order. So the underlying financial assumptions in the modelling are not consistent with the experience of the City of Edinburgh.
I mean, that's helpful. I'm sure those policy issues will be taken up by the lead committee. I mean, I don't know if the others want to comment on that at all. Or...
In terms of looked after children, is only relevant to the PBI sector in relation to funding that's going to come for the 2-year-olds.
I mean, obviously the biggest cost in the bill is the 600 hours going through local authorities. So I suppose the question, I mean, that's the centrepiece of the bill in a kind of way. Are people confident about the estimates around that? But I suppose associated with that, how do well, local authorities in particular, as the planners and commissioners of this, how do they feel? What steps will they have to take to ensure that that 600 hours is delivered? And I suppose another way of putting it is, most of the additional money extra staffing, and if so, is it adequate? What's being presented for that?
Well, certainly Midlothian Council has done, has looked at how we could deliver the 600 hours, the additional early years and childcare. And the projections that we're looking at are quite different to the figures which are contained within the financial memorandum. It's still at early stages yet. We're looking at projections, we're working out costs with the accountant, but certainly the figures we're coming out with are substantially lower than the estimates which are in the bill. There could, of course, be other complications that come in with that, but without having absolute certainty that this is going to be funded and how much it's going to be funded, local authorities in the current financial situation are looking to try and achieve the best settlement for the best way forward for this provision with the least cost attached for the councils, for the local authorities.
Would you like to comment on that?
I have to here. The PVI sector provides about 40% of the provision for 3 to 5-year-old children, and we provide the flexibility that working parents require, and also those parents who are accessing training prior to going back into the workplace. Partners are very, in fact, crucial to local authorities to allow them to meet their statutory requirements of providing this 3 to 5 provision. And for us, as we said in our statement, there's currently a funding shortfall which will only increase with extended hours. the NDNA did a survey recently, and respondents said that they were on average losing £584 per child per year with funding costs. And if we extend to 600 hours, which in Glasgow we already are doing, the loss would be in the region of £738 per child per year. So we have issues of sustainability.
Okay. And did Edinburgh have a view on that? Or?
Well, I think it's been covered by my colleagues.
Okay, thanks. And the last area I'll just ask about, because I suppose I'm almost picking out the kind of headline issues and the salient issues that people are talking about around the bill is the named person issue. Now, obviously, there's policy controversies around that, but in terms of the cost of that, and I mean, I'm told Edinburgh already implements this more or less. I don't know whether that's true in detail, but again, I wonder whether the cost estimates for that are accurate or adequate.
Certainly, in respect of our own position, because it's largely implemented already, we don't see that in terms of the council as being a major issue. I think there's still some concerns about the funding of named persons for under fives, where the responsibility rests with health visitors, and I think you'll hear more evidence about that this morning at a later session. But in respect of our own authority, because we've implemented a lot of those measures already, then the 3.5 hours is seen as adequate. We do have some concern, though, that the funding is not recurring. The funding for the health service and for training and development and funding of health visitors is recurring. That's not the case for the local authorities, and that has been pointed out. Certainly, I know that some other colleagues, and maybe that Magnus wants to come in here, but some other councils have concerns that the funding for the named person is not adequate to cover their needs, particularly if they've got a longer journey to go in implementing getting it right for every child. And there are also some issues still to be negotiated, I think, with the education unions around the overall what this means for job sizing for staff, particularly primary head teachers.
Yeah, I would certainly say that there are concerns about how this can be implemented in practice within Midlothian, and it'll be useful to learn from Edinburgh how they've proceeded with it. For example, if the onus is on the education side to provide the named person, then there's significant holidays through the course of the year, particularly 7 years during the summer. And we're then looking at how do we arrange to have that cover? How do we put situations or circumstances in place so that referrals are handled, there's somebody who can deal with them, they're flagged up to the appropriate person, and yes, I can imagine what would happen if you go to teaching unions and say, we'd like you to do this over the summer holidays for however many hours every week. I'm not sure how that would go down with them.
Okay, that's enough for me, thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd like to apologise to our guests and colleagues for my lateness. I'm afraid I thought the committee started at the usual time of 10. I was just sitting upstairs in my office, scratching myself, waiting to actually come down. So I'd like to thank Deputy Convener John for actually holding the fort in my absence. The next person to ask questions will be Gavin, to be followed by Jamie.
I want to, I guess, go through the written submissions that each of you have helpfully submitted to the committee. We'll start maybe with Alistair Gaw from the City of Edinburgh Council. Mr Gaw, if I heard you correctly, I think you said in relation to the kinship care that is part of the bill, I think you said your view, or Edinburgh's view, was that the savings laid out in the financial memorandum were exaggerated. Is that have I written down correctly what your views? Are you able just to expand on that, particularly for the public record? To what degree are those savings exaggerated? I suppose looking specifically at the memorandum, to what degree are they exaggerated? Are they out marginally? Are they out enormously? It'd be helpful just to get a rough idea of what sort of figures we're talking about.
But I think the first thing I would say, it is very difficult to make those kind of estimates into the future. And what we're being asked to do with this section of the bill really is to accept that it's fully funded on the basis of speculative savings. And they are completely speculative savings, and the bill's not fully funded in that respect. The main issue really is there's two elements to this. In terms of savings, the council doesn't believe that the number of looked after children entering kinship placements will reduce by the levels estimated. And the reason for that is that the modelling that's been done in the financial memorandum is based on the growth of the number of looked after children in kinship placements between 2007 and 2011 across the country, which grew by 87%. Now, in the City of Edinburgh, that equivalent growth was only 29%. So, projecting ahead, there isn't the same growth for us then to make that saving from. It just isn't there. So that's the biggest number. But also, in respect of informal kinship carers, there's a distinction. This is fiendishly complicated. I do apologise to members. I think everybody wrestles with the number of different types of kinship carer arrangements that exist, but that's the reality of the landscape we're working in. But formal kinship carers are children who are looked after by the local authority on a statutory basis. And it's estimated that in the city of across the country, there's around 3,000 of those children. But there's also an estimate that in terms of informal kinship care arrangements, where wider families are caring for children, there's around 16,000 of these arrangements in the country, although nobody really knows. And the bill estimates, the memorandum estimates that between 1.5% and 3% of those informal carers may come forward for an assessment for a kinship care order. Now, we just think that, and there's absolutely there's no substance to where that estimate came from. There's no reference to where it came from. It's just literally, out, as far as we can see, out the air. We think that many more families who are in informal kinship care arrangements will come forward for an assessment, because attached to that assessment there is support for those families in the future.
Obviously, you cannot speak for other councils. Some of them have submitted evidence or so on, but I'm assuming you informally speak to other councils. Is your sense that Edinburgh is alone in this respect, or do you get a feeling that that is...
If you examine the submissions from other local authorities that have put submissions in, Dundee, Falkirk, the others, you'll see that the concerns are consistent.
I would also agree that the figure of 1.5% to 3.5% is... it depends on the circumstances that are made available and the support that's available to kinship carers through this order, but that there could be many times that number, potentially, depending on what those circumstances are.
Mr. Gore, you made specific reference to table 28 of the financial memorandum in response to Mr. Chisholm's questions. I just wonder if you're in a position now or later to follow up with this about that table, particularly the bottom two tables. We've got avoided future costs. There's a lower estimate and an upper estimate for each of the financial years from 15-16 to 19-20. We take 15-16 just because it's the first one. Avoided future costs, the lower estimate is touching £3.5 million for that year, with the upper estimate being just over £15 million. Is your view that we're likely to be towards the lower estimate? Is your view that the lower estimate is a little optimistic? I'm just trying to get I take your point that you feel the savings are exaggerated, but I'm just trying to get a feel for where you think the savings might lie if we take 15-16 as a...
Yeah, I think it's potentially even the lower estimate is exaggerated. That's my own view, but really they're not based on any firm evidence, and that's the difficulty. There's a couple of other reasons for that. I was going to say earlier, when my mind went blank, that the other issue is that much of how kinship care orders will operate will be determined in secondary legislation. So we don't actually know what will be available to families and how these will operate, what expectations there'll be on local authorities around how long families should get support, the nature of that support, what that support might cost. So that's one issue. But this is premised on the assumption that if kinship care orders are made and there's some initial work completed with families, they'll no longer need any ongoing support of the type that's currently being provided. And in reality, that's not the case. Even families who don't have any formal involvement through the legal statutory order, currently some children who are in Section 11 orders, which is an informal kinship care arrangement, or where the extended family have parental rights, some of those families need quite high levels of support from local authorities. Others don't need any. So some of the assumptions upon which this is modelled really need to be looked at more closely.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. I'll move on to the Midlothian child partnership submission, if I can. You state there it will be very difficult to find funds and resources to meet the additional duties of the bill. You've touched on, I think, part of that, but you make the specific comment about having a named person service, presumably for those aged 5 to 18, over the holiday periods. I guess that doesn't apply for 0 to 5. Can you just expand on what you think the difficulties are going to be there, and have you had any sort of feedback or response from those in charge of the bill about how it might be managed?
It's not so much a difficulty, it's arrangements that need to be made in order to provide that cover. One of the proposals that Midlothian is looking at is setting up effectively extending the call centre to deal with these referrals, or putting in place staff who will deal with these referrals, record the details of them, put them into a system, and then that system needs to be flagged up to be dealt with by somebody. Over the holiday period, does that then fall to a social worker? Does that fall to, who takes on that responsibility as named person when the education isn't there for the school holidays? So it's, as I say, it's not necessarily a difficulty. It's just finding the resources, finding the staff, making the arrangements. We're also looking at, in order to provide the named person service when the schools are in, we need to make sure that the information which is relevant to them is available. So if a referral comes in, then they need to have access to appropriate systems. So, for example, we have a social work system. We're looking at the potential of putting that social work system into the schools so that the head teachers and so on have access to it, which comes with set-up costs, which comes with security that needs to be put in place to make sure that the information doesn't get out, that it's kept in a secure manner. So there's a lot of, in terms of on-the-ground implementation, there's a lot of detail that still needs to be worked out for that.
Just, from hearing you there, am I right then in thinking that during the school holidays, the named person, as it were, won't be doing the named person role? There'll be a sort of temporary named person type arrangement for those holidays. Did I hear you?
But it's not specifically mentioned in the bill as to who the intention is that the named person will be, is my understanding from, or recollection from reading it. But it is assumed to be part of the education remit of the council. Now, given that there are substantial holidays for the education staff, we couldn't be in a situation where somebody calls up with information about a child that they're looking to put to the named person in the first week of the summer holidays, and then nothing happens to it for 6 or 7 weeks. So something has to be in place. Now, that may not necessarily mean that the nominated named person changes at that point in time, but somebody needs to step in and fulfil that role, even if it's not necessarily a sheet of paper written, you are the named person for this child from this point.
Another comment you make at paragraph 5 of your submission on page 1, you make the point that when the child, or when the children turn 5, at some point the named person ceases to be from the NHS to being in the school or under the auspices of the council. There doesn't appear to me to be any sort of formal budget line or cost laid out for that. But I mean, is that a really easy process where where there won't be any costs involved, or as you point out, are there likely to be some cost or resource involved in that?
But there is work ongoing. Certainly, there's a Pan-Lothian protocol. There's work ongoing to try and share information between, or there already is information shared between local authorities and health and so on. But at this point, we need to get a bit more detail about exactly what will be involved, what information will be recorded, and then how that is transferred from one place to the next. If it's all recorded in a computer system, there's information taken from one computer system and put into another one. Is that work going to be funded? There'll be IT staff within local authorities, there'll be IT staff within the NHS that need to get that all arranged and make sure that it can be retained securely.
Thank you. And if I can move on lastly, then just to the submission from the National Day Nurseries Association, we got a letter from the Minister dated the 12th of September. I don't know if you've been able to get a copy of it.
I had seen it, do not have it with me. Yes.
Sure. I mean, I'll read out the line that I think is relevant to you. The financial memorandum includes an estimate of £1.2 million for operating partner provider payments in line with inflation from 2007. That, I think, is probably the most relevant. Does that change your submission to this committee? I think that is
specifically referring to 2-year-olds. It's not referring to 3 to 5-year-olds.
So
that's the new provision that's been put in place for that.
sure. It doesn't specifically say, but it may or may not. Okay, in that case, then your submission then was that the assumptions made around early learning and childcare are flawed, and the projections will need reconsideration. You say that at paragraph 14, page 3 of your submission. I just wonder if you can expand on that slightly.
At present, local authorities give a variety of different levels of funding to partner providers, and as I've already stated, partner providers are crucial to the statutory requirements. Local authorities, I'm sure my colleagues here will agree, cannot provide the level of education for 3- and 5-year-olds, and so they need to partner with the private and voluntary and independent sector. The money that the cost that's been brought about from the Finance Committee already is £4.09 per hour. At present, and that's for the 500 hours. At present, for example, Edinburgh are £3.26 per hour they're being given for the 500 hours. Glasgow, at the moment, we have gone up to 600 hours. We have to contractually do now, and we're receiving £2.72 per child. So the figure of £4.09, which has come forward, has evidently been based on the advisory floor, which ceased to exist several years ago and has had an inflationary link added into it. Our feeling is that that is not a sufficient funding when you take into consideration the staffing costs, and of course nowadays we are quite rightly upskilling on our workforce. We have to have a level of qualification to care and educate these children. So staffing costs are increasing dramatically. Business rates are increasing. Rent, resources, utilities, food consumables, the inherent costs that are part of caring and educating the children are rising considerably. And we see that the funding is crucially important to get that amount right. And £4.09 in real terms, if you think about that, for looking after a child for 600 hours is very difficult. The big issue that NDNA have is that, and it came further on, the issue of sustainability. If the costs are so low that it's not worth the while of the businesses to do it because they're losing money, then those nurseries will either cease to exist or they will come out of partnership, which will have ongoing concerns for the local authorities.
If I read paragraph 10 of your written evidence correctly, am I right in thinking then that the break-even point, as far as you're concerned, would be £4.51 per hour per child? Doesn't say that, but you say there's a short...
I have to say that I'm a nursery owner from Glasgow. I chair the network of NDNA. I'm not the chief executive nor the director of communications, who would normally be here but can't be here today. So I cannot, in all honesty, answer that question.
Sure, no, fair enough. I mean, perhaps somebody from the reason I say that is you say it's going to be £4.09, and that would leave a shortfall of 42 pence per child per hour. So I've literally added the two together.
Yep. Well, yes, in those terms, I do have my policy manager behind me, so she'll take notes and come back.
It'd be useful just to have that confirmed. That'd be helpful. Yep. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Gavin. Jamie, to be followed by John.
Thank you, Convener. And from my perspective, I think this is one of the most important bills that the Parliament can be considering right now. I think we could have a very interesting discussion about the policy implication, but clearly we're only here to look at the financial memorandum. But before I get into the nuts and bolts of that, I mean, I do take it as our starting perspective. We all welcome this bill, the idea that we can embed children's rights and do more to support the most vulnerable children. It's useful to know we're all in agreement then. So, in terms of the financial memorandum, and this is to Mr. Gaughan, the Council's submission to committee, you set out that the Council believes that the costs and any savings for children's rights, GIRFIC, early learning, childcare and other proposals are accurately reflected based on our understanding of the requirements of the legislation. Is that still the case?
I think that's certainly the position that Edinburgh Council has taken in respect to this. We had particular concerns about the kinship care, through care and aftercare and the impact on vulnerable children around the modelling of the costs of the bill. But overall, in respect of the other provisions, we don't have any major issues.
And it's a similar question in terms of Midlothian's submission. In your submission, you set out that the notes and details of the methodology used to calculate the estimates in the financial memorandum are welcomed and have been very useful. Again, is that still the case?
Yes, I mean, there are, as Alistair has mentioned before, in some cases there can be concerns about how these figures have been arrived at, but certainly it's useful to have had the information about how many of them have been calculated. I mean, to go back to the letter that was mentioned by Gavin earlier on about the change in the estimated costs for the, I believe it is the 2-year-old looked after children for the additional childcare hours. To increase that from £1.2 million per year to £4.5 million, or 1.1 to 4.5, I think it was, for a fourfold increase in the projected costs on the basis of negotiations with COSLA, it is quite concerning that, if that's one element of it that can go up fourfold in costs, as a result of thinking more about it, are there other elements of the costings that could do the same, in which case there's a significant shortfall there.
You're the first person I've ever heard from a local authority saying that a fourfold increase in funding for an element of local authority funding might be concerning. That's an interesting
Not just
perspective.
about that individual element of it, more about the general, the application and the extension of that to other elements of the bill.
So you wouldn't think this is concerning? Presumably you would welcome
Obviously, I would clearly welcome anything that helps achieve the savings that the council needs to achieve.
I mean, I want to turn to that letter because I actually think we're talking a little at cross purposes here, because there's actually two elements to this letter. One, and that element I think applies across the board to 3- and 4-year-olds, and there's another section for 2-year-olds which I'll come to in a second. Just to quote, well not quote, but to get it clear, it is the initial financial memorandum put in £1.1 million for extending funding funded early learning and childcare to 2-year-olds who are looked after or subject to kinship care order. And this is obviously going to increase by 3.4 million to 4.5 million. Now, I understand Midlothian welcome this, but could the other witnesses set out, presumably you welcome this as well?
Yes.
Absolutely, any funding that's going to be there for the children, because as you quite rightly said, this is all about the children of Scotland.
Okay. Gavin read it, and I'm going to read it again. Another part of the letter. The financial memorandum also includes an estimate of £1.2 million for uprating partner provider payments in line with inflation from 2007, and presumably, Ms Murray, this is where the £4.09 figure comes from that estimate. What Gavin didn't read out is that the letter then goes on to say, we now think this figure should be in the region of £2 million to more accurately reflect the financial pressures of local authorities and partner providers, and this too has been reflected in the budget. So it's actually been increased from £1.2 million to £2 million. Again, presumably you would welcome this.
Yes, we would also like to recommend that when this money comes to local authorities, it actually gets to the providers, the partner providers, in the way that the government anticipates. And we would like to recommend that the committee, and the bill might reintroduce the advisory floor, because that's a very good way of
what we really need
sure
to do, therefore,
that the
is
money
to focus maybe a
which
little
came
bit
from
less
government
on the
to the local
full
authorities
blocks,
actually
whether
went
it's
to the
NHS,
partner
or local
providers.
authorities, so on, and look within
Clearly
this,
that'll be a
these
matter
blocks
for
about
the
how we
lead
spend
committee,
that
but
money.
it's
And
on
that's
the
why,
record. I'm sure
as echoing the
pick up
point
on that,
made
but
by
in terms
Fraser,
of the
it is
fundamental
crucial
point,
that we
this
use
is
the
a
other
significant
levers, such
increase.
As long as
in
it's
this.
become, as long as it's a relevant and robust funding package that's going to meet the needs of the providers to provide the high quality education that's required for our children.
I mean, I suppose essentially, and you can tell me if this is correct, essentially your point is that funding increase is welcome so long as it comes to the partner.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. One final question, if I may, convener, because it's something obviously I have an interest in as the deputy convener of the Welfare Reform Committee. It's something this committee has focused on, and Mr Gaw spoke about the challenge of welfare reform, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how it interacts with this bill and specifically its financial provisions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert on welfare reform, but there's no doubt that
That's another.
But there's no doubt that if you look at the potential for in the through care and aftercare provision, for example, a lot of the work that we do with young people leaving the care system is about trying to make sure that they're in employment, that they have decent accommodation, and they have a chance to go on with their lives. And if there is an impact in terms of their income through, for example, what's colloquially known as the bedroom tax, then that could have an impact on their overall levels of income. Similarly, kinship carers may or may not fall into a category where they're exempt from these measures. We don't know what the position of that will be yet, but there's undoubtedly risks for them in some of the potential consequences of welfare reform and how that might impact on their own responsibilities. If the same levels of benefits are not available as had been in the past, then any better off assessment that's done by a council will then inevitably mean that the amount of money that the council will have to put in to top that up will be more. So there's a number of different ways in which the interplay between the DWP and the benefit system and what we try and do with kinship carers can actually have quite unintended effects.
Okay, the now deposed Deputy Convener.
Thank you. Well, I waited 2 years to actually chair this committee for 5 minutes, so that was good. But yeah, we've covered a lot of ground already. I just wanted maybe Ms Murray come back to you on a few of the figures. I realise that's maybe not your specialist area. But I mean, on the general point of, you suggested that actually nurseries are losing money at the moment. Can you explain to us how does that work? I mean, is there cross-subsidy going on, or what's happening?
The survey showed that when you look at the real costs involved, now this is across the whole of Scotland, so that there's different ways, and it also depends on what the funding that local authorities are actually giving them. They're being subsidised. The funding is there for the 2.5 or the 3 hours, depending which local authority you're in, for the education that the 3- and 5-year-olds get. It's probably subsidised by the daily rate and things that parents have to pay for their place for their child.
So parents or whoever is paying slightly more in order to subsidise effectively
because the incipient costs, as I explained.
The lower rate, yes. I mean, presumably, would I be right in saying that as you increase your numbers, the kind of marginal cost, the extra cost, would not be so great for an extra child because you've already got your heating and lighting and things?
I absolutely accept that, and and that takes something else into to discuss. I think is the fact that some local authority areas will not partner with high quality nurseries in an area because they have a nursery in the same area, perhaps not of as good quality, and parents are not choosing to go to the local authority nursery but are choosing to go to the non-partner nursery because of the quality of provision there. So one of the other issues that's involved in here is parental choice, and how important it is that local authorities, when they are partnering, partner with good quality provision.
Mm-hmm. Are the local authorities transparent about how much it actually costs of a child in one of their facilities?
No, far more than it costs.
Right, you reckon, but you reckon it's far more?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
Well, maybe that's a good opportunity to ask. Is that the feeling of local authorities? Do we know that they are paying their facilities cost a lot more than the private sector?
I'm not in a position to comment on that, I'm afraid.
Right, okay, fair enough. Okay, so if just to go over some of the ground that was there before, you'd like a floor then, so that everybody, presumably it would be higher than 272, it would be more like around £4 or something like that?
More than that, yes, more, as much, well, as ever, money is, we understand money is very, very tight, but if we're wanting to have this high quality provision for our 3 to 5-year-olds in partnership with nurseries, we have to get appropriate and relevant funding.
Okay, thanks so much. And just the other area I wanted to touch on was the whole question of looked after children and through care and after care. And it kind of jumped out at me that I think we're talking, there's various figures around, but the figure that was suggested in the financial memorandum is an annual cost of £3,142 per young person. But I think COSLA had suggested it was actually 6,000. And I just find that quite surprising that even, I mean, I think projecting, it's very hard to project figures, I totally accept that. But when we're looking at current costs, how can there be such a disagreement between what the FM saying of 3,142 and COSLA's suggestion of 6,000? And then added into that, the fact that apparently to assess somebody or to deal with an application is £1,042. And I mean, again, if half the cost of an annual support is actually doing the assessment, that seems very strange to me. Could you, Mr. Gaw, I suppose that's yourself, is it? Could you comment on that?
Yes, I think the assessment's separate to the provision of the services, but we didn't have a particular issue in Edinburgh with the levels that were set in the financial memorandum on this issue, but I know other colleagues across the country have, and some of them certainly think that the overall estimate of up to £6,000 would be more accurate, but it is up to £6,000. This is resources to deal with any crisis or emergency situations that young people find themselves in, to pay for any advice and training and counselling, and the needs that young people have as they go out the care system and into more independence vary enormously, and it's to try and put one figure on that, I think, is really quite misleading. These are very rough averages, and you'll note, I think, the phrase "up to" is used quite a lot in this memorandum, in the memorandum, and that's why we didn't in Edinburgh take any particular issue with those figures.
Right. So compared to, say, younger children, where it's going to be more even, or it's more predictable what the costs would be with that age group, it's going to be more, it's more difficult, it's going to vary more, is that?
It is, yes. Absolutely.
Right,
I mean, I think that we hugely welcome the fact that there's potential here for support and provision for very vulnerable young people up to the age of 25. Really welcome that. And clearly there's lots of other avenues for support that young adults can go to without having to go back to the local authority as the corporate parent to support them. But nevertheless, what we said in our submission is that although we wouldn't quibble with the figures in the financial memorandum in terms of the potential cash for £200 for an emergency or £1,200 for counselling session or whatever, a counselling course, whatever, what we did think is that from our experience, more young people would take up those opportunities than the financial memorandum estimates, and that's to do with the work that we put in to keep in touch with young people as they become young adults, and clearly good practice and what we would like to promote across the country is really good engagement, particularly for young people who don't have any extended family, so that they have somewhere they can fall back on, so that they can go out, they can make a mistake, they can come back and they can get support, and for their long-term benefit and health and for long-term positive outcomes, which of course can save the taxpayer a huge amount of money, these services are absolutely critical.
Okay, I mean, I think your answer is good. The £1,000 of dealing with an application, I mean, in comparison to the kind of level of support somebody gets, it seems quite heavy, but maybe that's something also that varies quite significantly from place to place and person to person.
Can you point to the part of the financial memorandum where that refers to, please, Mr. Mason, because I'm not completely sure of that.
It's under page 63, table 19, paragraph 101, towards the end. It talks about estimated application / process costs at 1,042 based on average caseloads. It just kind of jumped out at me that if we're spending half as much on assessing somebody as actually what we support them with, we're better just giving them £1,000.
Yeah. I have to say that if a young person is going through the care leaving process, then they will have a pathway plan, there will be an assessment, all of that work is done, and
yes,
it's an iterative process. It's not that they have to come back in, get some completely new assessment, and have a whole load of administration around that. So you know, the way that these figures are separated out doesn't really make a lot of sense to me either, I have to say.
Okay, thanks so much.
I wasn't sure if it was maybe the cost of the through care aftercare teams divided out by the number of young people that they support. That's because I would agree with Alistair that it seemed like, and agree with yourself, it does seem like a very high figure, and there's not really a formal application process that's involved that would cost that amount of money. So my speculation was that it was the cost of these teams divided out by the number of children they're supporting.
Thanks so much.
I think it's good to see that the children next door in the creche are so keen to make a contribution to this morning's deliberations. Jamie, please supplementary.
Yes, no, it just occurred to me, it's not a question, Convener, and thank you for allowing me the chance, but it occurs to me that I should have declared an interest when, in my line of question, Ms Murray, as my children attend a nursery in partnership with the local authority, so I thought I should put that on the record.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, well, I'm going to wind up with some questions myself, as that's exhausted the questions from members of the committee. I usually kick off with the questions, but for obvious reasons I decided to let the committee charge ahead. It's quite interesting because they often complain that I take all the juicy questions and they're left with the ones that are left over, so now we've got a wee bit of a reversal of that role. So I want to kick off with Ms Murray and just get some clarification on some of the kind of issues that have come up in her paper. We have obviously discussed much of this, but you say in paragraph 9, talking about the advisory flow, that rating this figure as inappropriate and forms a weak basis for estimating future costs. But then in the appendix, you talk about, in terms of directing sufficient funding to nurseries, one option might be to reintroduce an advisory floor minimum level of funding and review this annually. And some local authorities' funding has remained static since it was removed several years ago. So it's just to get clarification on exactly what your position is in terms of this advisory floor.
The advisory floor we would recommend it would be to, so that all local authorities would know what was there for the children, because what happened before, when the money is now coming into GAEs and it's not been distributed equally amongst partner providers. So the advisory floor, was that the second bit we're talking about here, sorry?
The advisory floor was, you're just saying how rating it is inappropriate and forms a weak basis for estimating future costs, but then you go on to say that perhaps it should be reintroduced. So I'm wondering why there's a contradiction between saying it's inappropriate and forms a weak basis, but at the same time you're saying it should maybe be introduced but reviewed annually. I was referring to that, what it was before, how it was before, and the fact that the £4.09 that has been based on the advisory floor as it was discontinued. Okay. Now, in terms of this £4.09, it's not really, although it's supposedly £4.09 a child, if we have staff ratios from 1 to 10 moving to 1 to 8, then £4.09 would actually mean £32.72 per hour, would it not? Because you'd have one member of staff looking after 8 children. It's not a kind of one-to-one kind of service. So I think that kind of changes the kind of, we're all thinking £4 an hour, but I think when you look at that, it kind of gives a different kind of reflection. Now, in paragraph 15, you talk about being not confident that partner providers of early learning and childcare can meet the costs associated with the bill unless measures are taken to ensure sufficient funding is allocated to local authorities and actually reaches providers in the form of a viable hourly rate, which again we've touched on. But I'm just wondering, again, if you can provide us with any details of how much, because I think that's really quite something. If the government's going to try and increase funding, what would that viable hourly rate really be?
Well, I think what we're saying is that what the councillor said here was that the £4.09 plus the 42 pence makes it much more of a viable unit. As ever, we would accept as much money as possible, as everybody does, because the cost, you might say that's a 1 to 8 or 1 to 10 staff member, but we have all, as has been discussed already, the different elements of costing that has to go into that. So if we want our children to grow up so we're not going to have these incipient costs of care later on, all the research is showing that good quality early years education from 3 to 5 is the best way to go, because it gives them the stability and the good start to life that they have. So naturally, the more funding that we can have in place, the better the provision we can have for them, the level of qualification of the staff, which is crucially important. These can all be met.
I mean, I think we would all fully agree with that. Of course, the issue is, of course, that, you know, funding is always limited, and, you know, we have to strike a balance between the public purse and what you have suggested
but
there.
I think the most important, sorry to interrupt,
No,
the most important thing is that the funding that you decide upon is equally and fairly delivered to the partner providers.
And so would you suggest that the £4.51 which you've mentioned, if it was uprated, would that be a reasonable amount if it was uprated annually?
I suppose I would have to say yes to that. I have not personally done figures on the back of that, but in relation to the 272 that I'm receiving at the moment,
yes, of course, absolutely. You know,
that would make a huge difference.
It would almost be a lottery win, I suppose, by comparison, indeed. Why is there such a variation, incidentally?
Well, in Glasgow's perspective, it's only because we're providing the 600 hours contractually, and they didn't up the funding at all because they didn't have any money. But
Right,
they told
so
us to do 600 hours.
Right, so you're expected to do an extra
but
125 hours for nothing.
the average, I think we put in here. So it just depends, and that's where the advisory floor would even that out and
yes,
make
and
it
at least
fairer.
ensure that you're
Make
getting
it fairer.
being resourced for the 625 hours. Okay. One other thing before I move on to colleagues there is paragraph 17 is quite interesting at the where you say there's presently an iniquity in the number of hours of preschool education to which a child's entitled depending on their birth date. And the report Unequal Start highlights that what this can mean a funding gap to families up to £1,000 a child depending on their birth date. Can you tell us a wee bit more about that?
that is because a child can go to school. The cut-off date is the 28th of February. So a child can go to school when they're that age. The other issue for the local authorities is that they will not pay for the extra, and I'm not getting this right, can I just rethink what I'm saying here, sorry. The fact is that a child who doesn't meet the going into school in May, or into nursery, it's a nursery school, into nursery in May, they do not get any funding for that last term. They don't get the funding until the following August. So we're talking about nursery-age children here, not school-age children, nursery-age children in their preschool. And so the children who are 3 after that or before that get extra terms of funding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically, so because of this fairly arbitrary...
It's an age-related thing. And most local authorities, that's what happens. They don't get funding until the term following their 3rd birthday.
Right, and so obviously that's something you feel clearly should be addressed. I'm sure. Certainly to me it does seem somewhat unjust, although all my children were born in the summer months. So I do not have my youngest is 15. But anyway, just to go on to yourself, Mr Inglis, next. You say in paragraph 6 of your own submission that the bill will require more midwives, health visitors, teachers and school administration staff, childcare staff, family counsellors, etc. But you don't actually specify how much for a local authority like Midlothian. Now, given that we're going to be producing a report with some recommendations to the Minister, we want to try and tie down some of these figures. And obviously, if Midlothian had robust information on that, we could perhaps help to extrapolate across Scotland. So I'm just wondering what figures you would have in terms of that for your own local authority.
I'm just checking to see.
You down?
Yes, I did do some estimates based on the additional hours, for example, that would be needed for a named person in the teaching role, education role. And in Midlothian, that would work out as around about 2.2 full-time equivalent teaching posts in Midlothian, based on that as a very rough estimate. Additional administrative support, in fact, I've taken that figure out. I don't have the figures in front of me for the other ones. I did also have a look at how many additional support assistants for administration within the primary schools and secondary schools would be as well. But I haven't got a note of those with me, unfortunately.
It'd be good to provide us with any of that kind of information. Obviously, You also say in paragraph 11, you talk about the resources to meet the additional duties of the bill, and you say this must be most severe regarding the additional hours of childcare early learning, which, based on the figures in the financial memorandum, are estimated up to 1.8 million per year for Midlothian Council. Now, you're saying up to 1.8 million. How close to 1.8 million are we talking about? And is this, in how many years? Is this something that should go on for 1, 2, 3, 4 years, or is this a kind of permanent additional burden on the council?
Well, what I did for that was I looked at the estimated costs for this provision within the bill across the whole of Scotland, and then looked at the population of Scotland for 0 to 5 and looked at the population of Midlothian 0 to 5 and worked out those figures between them. So on that basis, the costs as provided by the financial memorandum extrapolated to Midlothian Council would be £1.3 million in 14-15, £1.7 million in 15-16, 1.8 in 16-17, and then levelling out at 1.6 million per year thereafter.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for providing that clarification. Now, in paragraph 9, you say it is noted that the financial memorandum has an extremely wide range of estimates, with the savings in the upper estimate coming in at up to 9 times that of the lower estimate. I'm just wondering what impact these kind of differentials have on the council's ability to plan ahead.
Well, all local authorities currently are under significant financial pressure. Midlothian Council is by no means alone in that. We're looking to achieve savings. We've achieved savings of £13.5 million in the last 3 years. We've got similar savings we're looking to achieve in the near future. So, you know, depending on how the funding for this is arranged, if the funding for this is worked out on the basis of the financial memorandum and the costs involved in it, if the actual costs of delivering this on the ground come out at the top level of these estimates, then there will be a significant shortfall in funding for Midlothian Council, and that would be unsustainable in the long term.
Now, when you talk about significant shortfall, what are we talking about?
Well, I mean, to look at the, if the estimated savings, for example, vary by up to 9 times, we're talking about the letter that was released recently that's quadrupled the funding and, by extension, the expected cost for that. The cost for the council could be easily another £1 million a year. If we're talking about the costs for the additional early learning and childcare of being £1.8 million a year, if that comes out as the wrong figure and it's significantly more than that, then it's a massive financial commitment for the council.
Okay. Quite interested to know about, this, obviously when this legislation is put together, the Scottish Government has to look at its own estimates. But it seems to me that, your own local authority is not absolutely off with its own estimates. I mean, how do we actually square the circle if the local authority doesn't know exactly how much this implementation would cost? How is the Scottish Government expected to be able to cover all bases in terms of estimating it on an All Scotland basis?
I absolutely agree. It's impossible for the Scottish Government and to come up with exact figures with it. I mean, to return to some of the comments that have been made previously, until we deliver this, we don't know how much it's going to cost. Because there will be, to quote the example, for example, that 1.5 to 3.5% of current informal kinship carers will come forward and claim the new kinship care order. Until that's in place and the word goes around the kinship carers within the whole of Scotland as to what's available and what the support is, there could be, this could become very popular. There could be a significant proportion of people come forward. So, I think it's very difficult for the local authority to estimate what these costs are going to be and for the community planning partnerships, but equally it's very difficult for the Scottish Parliament. The point is more that there is such a significant risk. There's a risk there that the costs will increase beyond what's included in any funding that's provided, and how are those costs met? Is there going to be an ongoing process of review of the cost inherent in the bill by the Scottish Parliament with the changes in the funding as we go forward? Or is it that they will be fixed early on and then that's it, that's your settlement, you have to provide for any additions within that?
So would you be looking for some kind of contingency funding for the first 2 or 3 years perhaps, in case there are kind of costs which no one has really foreseen, or costs which are significantly higher than both yourselves or the Scottish Government have considered? I
think that would be a prudent step. As I say, the budgets and the finance pressures on local authorities are significant, and we don't want to be caught in a position where we've agreed to deliver services. There's a lot of, the bill has as we've mentioned before, it's welcomed. There's a lot of very good work within that. Within that. We don't want to get to a position where we've started to provide these services or change the way that we deliver things and then discover there's a shortfall in funding because we've been too successful, because some of the savings from the prevention agenda could be some years to be realised. So in the short term, there's a transition period where we have to fund what we're currently doing for all the people who are already involved in the system. We also need to fund the preventative steps, for example, the additional hours for the early learning and childcare. And until that period is passed and we reap the benefits of those prevention measures, there's a big funding requirement in there.
Thank you very much for that. Mr Gaw, much of your submission was actually covered by colleagues, one of whom represents Edinburgh, one of whom represents the Lothians, including Edinburgh, and we discussed kinship care in some detail and after-through care. But I'm just wondering, in terms of your submission, in terms of the wider issues, can you maybe talk it through a wee bit about the training costs and what the impact that would have on Edinburgh City Council?
In relation to GIRFEC in particular, the named person...
The whole bill, because we're obviously looking at the financial memorandum in terms of the entire bill.
Yeah. We haven't seen, from our perspective, we haven't seen the issue of training costs as being one of the major concerns. We're much more concerned about the realism of the modelling of the costs around kinship care and through care and aftercare, and remain very concerned, and we think there may be unintended consequences as a result of that. The one issue around training, I think, for the council is that the training for the named person and around GIRFEC is focused purely on education staff, and also the funding's not recurring. There's an assumption that it will be absorbed into overall CPD activity across the council after the first year. Completely different approach has been taken in respect of health visitors, and there's recurring money for health boards to make sure that health visitors maintain their skills. We just see that as a bit of an inconsistency, really.
Council, I was going to ask you about that.
Well, I think that I think if the bill overall has the potential to be revolutionary in shifting the balance of care and in supporting early intervention and prevention if it's implemented properly, and training is part of that. And I think that if training is not properly funded, if the kinship care measures and through care and aftercare are not properly funded, the risk is that the money will be diverted from earlier intervention into supporting the other aspects of the bill, and actually it will become counterproductive. That's the greatest concern that I have.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, I'm just going to wind up the session, but I just want to ask any of our guests if there's any further points which you feel the committee haven't covered that you might wish to touch on.
I have one query that I have is that there are statements contained within the SPICE briefing, for example, saying that COSLA have confirmed that the Scottish Parliament have confirmed that this bill will be fully funded, and Alistair has mentioned previously about this. There's still a degree of uncertainty amongst local authorities, or certainly within Mid Lothian, about exactly what funding will be forthcoming to support this bill. We're doing a lot of work looking at how the provision of early years and childcare, for example, will be put in place and the costs that will be involved in that. But we're trying to do that on the basis of not quite knowing how much money we're going to get to do so. So it would certainly be very useful from our perspective to be able to say, this is how much money we're going to be getting, this is how we can allocate it, these are the final details of what's going to be going forward. I'm not sure if that's the same case in Edinburgh.
The one thing I would very much like to add is that my colleague Magnus said that it would be prudent to have some contingency around this, and that would be my plea. We fully support the measures in the bill. We think it's absolutely heading in the right direction. But the reality is that the measures, particularly around looked after children, there's been enormous difficulty in trying to model the costs, and we don't think that they're robust. And there has to be, and we, if that money comes out of the GAA and the next spending review, I think there would be major problems for us. It's really important that we maintain some consistency, as COSLA has asked, maintain some overview and make sure that as these measures unfold and we get the detail through the secondary legislation, that we make sure that there's sufficient resource there to enable the objectives of the bill to be met.
Further points at all?
No, just how important it is to get it right.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, I think that is the point. I mean, if we recall that the bill's primary purpose is to, and I quote, address the challenges faced by children and young people who experience poor outcomes throughout their lives, then clearly we do have to get it right. And the point that Mr Inglis made, which is a very good point, is something which I was going to actually raise directly with the bill team when they actually come forward, because I did note that myself in the Spice briefing. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for responding as well to our questions. I'd like to thank committee members for the questions. I'm now going to call a 5-minute recess to allow a changeover of witnesses. table. Our witnesses are seated, so we shall recommence the session, and we are continuing our work on scrutiny of the Children and Young People Scotland Bill Financial Memorandum. I'd therefore like to welcome our second panel of witnesses of the morning. So can I therefore formally welcome Mr Jim Carroll of NHS Ayrshire and Arran, Sally Egan of NHS Lothian, and Claire Mayo of the Royal College of Nursing. So a very welcome to you. And we're going to go straight into questions this morning, first of all. So I suppose the first question will be from me, as is usual. And what tends to happen here is I'll ask a question of someone specifically, perhaps, or it might be to the whole panel, but please, others, feel free if you wish to add anything, please feel free to do so. So first one I'll ask to Mr Carroll, being an Ayrshire MSP myself actually. Paragraph 4 of your submission, you say that the financial implications are not well represented or discussed, were not well represented or discussed at the events which your colleagues attended. And you've went on to say in paragraph 11 that expressed views suggest that NHS boards will not be able to meet the financial costs incurred by the bill. So I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a wee bit on that for us.
Well, really the process that we went through, people were entirely focused on health and social care integration and the consequences of the new Children's Bill. We had lots of interesting discussion, but there was very little information at those meetings to outline what the financial implications were going to be, or how indeed these financial implications were going to be assessed. I think we would very much welcome the bill. We have no issues with the content of the bill. We would also welcome the support given to the GIRFEC process in reaching full implementation. But we are concerned that to not just achieve the letter of the bill, if you like, but to actually achieve the cultural change we're hoping for in Scotland, then we will require to invest more heavily in early intervention prevention. We believe that the current system is effective, but if midwives and health visitors, in taking up the role of named person, are truly to capture the needs of those individual families, then that will take a significant amount of time, and we would estimate that's about 5 hours per family, depending on the nature of the family and the nature of the intervention required. Our concern is that we do not have the right numbers of staff to meet the current demand, and as we improve our intervention in early years, we believe that we will require more staff to actually be more effective in that intervention. We are quite confident that savings will be made later in the life course. Savings will be made in terms of integration and bringing together our systems, aligning our systems locally with local authorities, etc. will all achieve savings. But those savings will not be apparent within midwifery services or health visiting services. They're more likely to occur later in the life course. And to truly change the culture and to achieve those savings later in the life course, we think we need to invest more heavily in midwifery services and health visiting services.
Ayrshire and Arran Health Board covers about a third of a million people, so it's quite a good kind of snapshot of Scotland, and we can possibly extrapolate from that to a reasonable extent. I'm just wondering, therefore, what kind of additional health visiting staff, for example, you would require, what additional other staff, support staff you would require, what kind of resource you would need to actually make this bill work in Ayrshire and Arran?
I would love to be in a position to give you accurate figures on that, but as
even
we
ballpark would help. You know, 1 million, 10 million, somewhere in between. I mean, anything you can give us would obviously help the committee in its deliberations.
I think what we had estimated, but it is very crude in the terms of what we were trying to do, is working out how many additional health visiting staff and midwives we would need. And we would probably be looking at something approaching 10 additional midwifery staff and about 15 to 20 additional health visitors to be put in place, and at a cost of £21 an hour. The bill itself, I think, says £19.40 is what it...
£19.4
is it £19.4 is the estimate, and I think that's an average across Scotland, and that's perfectly appropriate and reasonable. That's the figures they had to work with. In Ayrshire and Arran, most of our health visiting staff are in the higher pay bands or in the higher age groups, and we are just conscious that that will make a significant difference to organisations as large as ours.
Now, I'm just wondering, Ms Egan, I wonder what the position is in Lothian, because obviously it's a much bigger health board, and I'm wondering if you agree with the kind of
Yes,
Sorry.
well, we've actually did quite a bit of financial modelling, both in terms of the Children's Early Years Change Fund and in response to the implications of the bill. Across Lothian, we have roughly just short of 50,000 0 to 5-year-olds and around 9,500 to 10,000 children in the making on the midwifery caseloads. So we modelled on that assumption. We looked at what the additionality would be using. There's a template. I was actually on the working group, the GIRFET working group that informed the financial memorandum from a health perspective. And we looked at what the additionality for midwifery at the various stages in the child's development, pre-birth and also post-birth. And based on those assumptions, we came to the conclusion that it would be probably around the £21 an hour, because the £19 that the financial memorandum group looked at a kind of midpoint of a band 6 health visitor and midwifery grading. And we looked at our age profile across the workforce, and we reckoned that, you know, if we costed on that, we would be facing incremental drift very, very quickly, because most of our staff were fairly high up their increments. So we costed on the midpoint plus 2 incremental points above that, which brought us to the £21. Factoring in our known birth rate and health visiting caseloads, we arrived at the conclusion that we would need an additional 49 health visitors and 20 midwives. Now again, as Jim said, it's fairly crude. It's based on a lot of discussion with staff frontline and what we know in terms of our early implementation of GIRFEC in Edinburgh. Edinburgh was a learning partner, and they're probably a bit further down the road in terms of taking on the role of the named person in health visiting, and it is additional work. So we spoke to a lot of people before factoring up our financial implications.
Okay, and I mean, I notice in paragraph 29 you say we do not think we can meet these costs, but then you go on to talk about, nor do we think there is the capacity within the health visiting workforce in Scotland to respond within the timeline. So it's not just about money, it's about the people to actually deliver
resource, it. Yeah. I mean, quite clearly, there is a general feeling across Scotland that perhaps we've not developed our health visiting workforce to meet the growing need and demand of our vulnerable children's population. I know within Lothian, having been the chief nurse in Edinburgh for a number of years, the health visitors increasingly were getting more and more high-level child protection work to support, which meant that their universal services, in their opinion, did not get the full attention that they would have liked, so they had to prioritise. I think in Lothian, I can't speak for other health boards, but certainly in Lothian, we have recognised this some 5 to 7 years ago, and we've tried to grow our health visiting workforce and also the support infrastructure to support them. This year, for example, we normally fully fund and train 6 health visitors through Queen Margaret University postgraduate training. This year, we are training 12 health visitors, but that really is in response to our projected retirements across Lothian. It's an ageing workforce. We need to attract young and enthusiastic nurses and midwives into the profession for the future. So we have started to grow our numbers of graduates who will graduate from Queen Margaret College as health visitors. We cannot guarantee that we will keep them in Lothian because they are free to go and take up jobs elsewhere, but we are trying to make the job as attractive as possible to them with ensuring that there is a support infrastructure. We also invested significantly to enable the health visitors to take on the 27 to 30 month review this year, and we are further investing to enable them to support the assessment of looked after children this coming year. But even with that additionality, it will not, in our opinion, be enough to enable full implementation of the named person role within the timeline.
Ms Mayo, continuing on this particular point, you estimated in paragraph 7 of your own submission that health visiting would require another 355 whole-time equivalent posts in order to deliver legislation. And in paragraph 15, you say nearly half, 45% of the NHS Scotland health visiting workforce is aged 50 or above. So there are clear concerns about staff capacity. How confident are you that we will be able to recruit the additional people to carry out this work, assuming that funding is put in place to actually be able to pay them on the...
I think if action's taken rapidly and the funding is put in place, we can do that. But there are two issues. The first, there's the issue around implementation of the getting it right for every child approach, that the named person approach within the bill. And it's great that Scottish Government have actually costed out the additional hours with the help of the committee. But our concern there is that those costings haven't taken into account the normal sort of workforce planning allowances. So actually the 355 posts, if you add the additional 22.5% that the Scottish Government agrees in terms of adding annual leave, maternity leave, you know, that brings that up to closer to 450. And as Sally Egan's rightly pointed out, the ageing workforce gives us an additional issue there. So there's the additional posts required to implement the bill, and there's the additional posts required to replace the existing workforce as many of them retire. Our concern is that across Scotland, there are different approaches to health visitor training. And what we'd like to see is the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing to take action and commission NHS Education for Scotland to look at health visiting programmes that are developed, you know, rapidly with national funding so that this can be done consistently across Scotland. NHS Lothian have led the way, but there are other health board areas where people are expected to go and do health visitor training on a bursary rather than seconded on salary to do that training with no guarantee of a job at the end of it. So there needs to be equity of educational provision across Scotland with equity of terms and conditions in the way in which people are able to undertake those educational opportunities, and that needs to happen now.
In terms of the additional staffing, though, I mean, clearly, you know, Scotland isn't uniform. There'll be some areas where there's severe pressure and other areas where there's less pressure. What do you think the Scottish Government should do to address specific geographic issues?
The Scottish Government is undertaking a number of pieces of work under the chairmanship of Rosemary Linus, who's the Director of Nursing in NHS Lanarkshire. And there's a significant review of capacity going on. What we need to do is find out how many health visitors there are across Scotland, which is a piece of work that the Information Services Division is undertaking. Look at robust workforce planning, which is a piece of work that's going on. Look at caseload. So caseloads are weighted according to need, geography, rurality, and the sort of significant deprivation issues that many of areas are facing. And that work is also going ahead. So once we have robust ways of making decisions about how many health visitors we need where, then I think every health board will be in a position to look closely at their particular needs with the support of, you know, robust evidence-based approaches to do that.
Now, this one is to whoever wishes to answer, although it's really in Ms Mail's report specifically, but we had local government colleagues in earlier on who expressed concern that training was considered in the financial memorandum for NHS but not for local authorities. But I noticed in the RCN submission you talk about open space, travel expenses, Minister of Support and Consumables not being in, and you go on to say paragraph 55 of the financial memorandum makes a case for administrative support in schools, but the same administrative support for the named person approach to developing and implementing a child's plan are required in the NHS. So it seems quite odd that, you know, training seems to be lacking, funding for training in local government and administrative support in the NHS, something that we'll no doubt put to the bill team following on from yourself. But I'm just wondering what kind of impact this you feel would have in terms of requirement for additional resources. Ms Mayo, it's in your report, so could you answer first and see if colleagues have anything to add to that?
The amount of money that was allocated in the financial memorandum for training was sort of one-off sum to NHS Education for Scotland to develop a training package. it felt as if there needed to be some more detail behind that, and for NHS Education for Scotland to actually come up with a proper costed education and training strategy, which may last a number of years. Clearly, there need to be national resources, but there was no provision made for face-to-face training, in order to the cost of actually delivering that training, and how that would be done across Scotland. So what we have asked for is that there is a proper costed education and development plan behind that sum that goes to NHS Education for Scotland, but also that the wider team are included within that training programme, because the success of getting it right for every child as it's been implemented is that it's a multi-professional, multi-agency approach for every child and family. And to be able to deliver the training in that way is very powerful. It's not just about dividing off health and saying there's the health bit, to actually look at everybody involved in a child's plan, everybody involved as a named person, and that includes the wider teams, not just those who are playing the named person role. And so it was that wider training for the whole workforce who are involved with children that we felt needed to be looked at and costed in a robust way.
Deegan?
And I would support everything that Claire's just said. I think at local level there's various things going on, whether that training is sufficient for the future role, because I think when you read the bill and the wider implications of being a named person, I think we need to up our ante really on the training. We need to make our staff really aware about the importance of information sharing. We need to support our information sharing processes. We don't really have the infrastructure to do that at the moment. So I think that's a very important part of the training, how staff handle data and how they share information. Within Lothian, we have a Lothian and Borders partners group, and we're trying to develop training modules across the partners so that there's some consistency. The big issue for us and the cost implication is about backfill, freeing up staff to actually undertake the training, especially when we don't actually have the human people to actually backfill. So it's not just about the money again, it's about actually having that capacity within the system. The other thing that we're doing in Lothian and Borders is our GIRFEC development manager, who works for the 5 local authorities, the 2 health boards and police. She will be working with Queen Margaret University on the postgraduate health visitor course to ensure that the newly qualified health visitors coming out have an understanding of what the named person role entails. Because currently within the curriculum, that really isn't covered in any depth because it wasn't part of the previous review. So as well as working with NES, we do need to work with the higher institutes of education to make sure that our courses are actually covering it as part of the core competencies within these courses.
Thank you. Mr. Carr?
I think I would fully endorse what my colleagues have said and wouldn't want to repeat that. I think what I would like to do, though, is add that the costings for the bill are predicated in the main for health on the named person and that function. The significant investment required in terms of information and developing the appropriate systems that would allow us to take that forward. And in Ayrshire, we've developed Ayrshire, which is an online system that allows the development of a single child's plan and the single chronology under GIRFEC. And that's a system that's inputted to and shared jointly with our local authority colleagues, and that system will eventually be widened. But there's also significant costs under the implementation of the new bill for looked after and accommodated children, for example, for health. And if health are to fully perform its function for that group of children, then there's additional costs that are going to come with that, because we have to look at the initial health needs assessment for looked after accommodated children and how we make that far more robust and far more effective. We also have to develop systems where we can support our local authority colleagues in deciding where those children should be placed and where that would be most effective for those children and young people. We very much want to make sure that that's done as locally as possible, as close to that child's home as possible. So there's a number of other issues contained within the bill that may not have an obvious impact on health, but we believe certainly will do over time. I think the bit I'd want to support more strongly is the need to actually have joint training and implementation and how we take that forward. I think we have to take on board the burden for effective monitoring and evaluation of all of these different systems and the costs that are associated with that. But it is extremely difficult to say at this point in time what those costs will be. And from our point of view, we would very much like to argue for the financial implications for the bill to be kept under review over the next 2 to 3 years at the very least, so we can actually feed back in much more accurate information to committees such as this, and so you can actually have a good sound basis for making decisions for the future. But we really do strongly feel that we are not in a position at this point in time to tell you what the additional burden is going to be. We are clear we will make savings, but there's costs associated with this as well, and it's finding the balance between the savings to be made and where an additional investment needs to be made.
I'm now going to open out the session to colleagues around the table, and the first to ask questions will be Malcolm, to be followed by Jamie.
Well, it's probably only going to be one question, because most of what I was going to ask has been covered. I mean, it's the cost of the named person, obviously, that I was particularly interested in, and you've given a very comprehensive answer to that. But I'm interested in two of the policy proposals from the RCN which may have financial implications. Well, they certainly do in the case of the health visitors, but I suppose there is a strong emphasis from the RCN. The named person should always be a health visitor, and you go further in terms of a statutory entitlement to universal health visiting services, which I'm very attracted to. But I suppose I'm interested in NHS Lothian talking about health visitors and midwives. So I suppose that is possibly more a question to NHS Lothian, to Sal Egan. You know, is that a policy choice or is that a financial choice? And would it make any difference financially whether it was a health visitor or a midwife? And I'll just roll it all up in one question in the interest of time. To the RCN, obviously, you've got a big focus also in your, well, certainly in your initial submission, both to this and the Health and Social Care Bill, that you're very concerned about two legislative proposals, which you think, you know, is likely to have to lead to two different approaches to the planning, delivery and governance of integrated care. So again, I suppose we shouldn't stray too much into the wider policy implications, but I would be interested in whether you think there are financial consequences of that policy decision. So it's kind of like two questions, I suppose. First to Sally Egan, I'm interested in NHS Lothian's view on midwives as distinct from health visitors.
Yes. Well, we have, within NHS Lothian, we have agreed that the midwife will be the named person for the mother and the unborn child. Now, the child, until it's born, doesn't have legal status, but our midwives are, and have been for a number of years, very involved in early detection around vulnerability and child protection. So we're not starting from scratch with our midwives. We've also refreshed the maternity framework in Scotland, and we've a policy around reducing antenatal inequalities. So the role of the midwife is recognised within the GIRFEC policy context, as you know. We have been training our midwives to take on this role, but with a recognition that there will be coordination, administration, support function, etc. So we would see the midwife being the named person up until that child is born and the 10th day. Now, obviously, when the child goes into hospital, they may come out when the baby's born, and the child may come out from hospital very, very quickly after birth, but it could go to a neonatal unit. So there's a lot of discussions going on. Who would the named person be for that child if it wasn't discharged home with its mother? Within our universal pathway, the midwife would hand over to the health visitor around the 10th day. But where there was vulnerability, they would start planning together for that child and that family's needs as early as possible, with a recognition that it would involve other people. It wouldn't just be the midwife. So one of the things that we're trying to do is embed some of the earlier recommendations in Health for All Children, which was about midwives and health visitors working more proactively together during the antenatal period. So that work has started going on. So within our pathway, we would see the midwife taking on a named person role, provided they had the infrastructure to support. We wouldn't see them taking on the lead professional role, which we've not spoken about, which isn't within the legislation. But they certainly would take on a named person and coordinating role, because they would be looking after the mother and the unborn child. At the 10th day, we would see the health visitor. Currently, we have a model where the health visitor, and it's a qualified registered nurse stroke health visitor, would see a child and family at least 4 times in the home setting unless there was reasons why they couldn't gain access. So we do see it being the health visitor. For our teenage pregnant population, where they're part of the FNP programme, we see the family nurse as being that named person for that family. What we also see is that the health visitor and the family nurses can't do it all, so it will be a whole mix of other professionals supporting. We have much of that at the present, nursery nurses, children and family centres, etc. Staff nurses, increasingly our health visitors have staff nurses specialising in children in early years within their skill mix establishment. But essentially we would see it being midwife, health visitor and FNP nurse in the main for that pre-birth to preschool population.
Okay, and Claire Mayo?
Thank you. As you say, in our submissions, we have stated that we believe that the bill should clearly state that the named person following on from the midwife for the under 5s should be a health visitor. And that really confirms what is already happening in practice. But having the statutory entitlement to a universal service gives that consistency across Scotland. And it will have financial implications. But we believe that that's necessary in order to deliver the named person service as the vision is within Getting It Right for Every Child. And I think that proper resourcing is absolutely essential, because if we're raising expectations with families that they will have the support of a named midwife, health visitor or teacher, we have to put the resources in place to support the professionals who are delivering that service, or really we're setting them up to fail, which is why I think the resources behind the bill are so important. In terms of the policy question around the 2 bills coming through Parliament at the same time, the Public Services Joint Working Bill, there do appear to be anomalies between those 2 bills, and we're greatly reassured that the Local Government and Regeneration Committee are examining the 2 bills side by side, and we hope that by looking at the governance processes that are contained, within the Children's Services Planning section of this bill, and the issues that are very similar around joint working in the Public Services Joint Working Bill, that hopefully the financial implications will be that those services are actually, the 2 bills work in a way that there are not negative consequences financially, rather that these 2 sets of planning proposals do actually blend in a coherent way. And I think it's really important that the committees responsible for the bills do actually ensure that that's the case.
You think if your favoured model was adopted, that would have, irrespective of whether it's good in policy terms, would that have cost savings, or is that not really the main point from your...
I don't think that's really the main point, but clearly whichever model is proposed, it needs to be effective from a financial point of view, as well as from a governance and service delivery point of view.
Thank you, Malcolm. Jamie, to be followed by Gavin.
Thank you, Convener. And I think it's probably fair to say, not having looked in great detail at this bill, but I think it's fair to say from having watched its coverage, this has obviously been a fairly controversial area, perhaps because it's more misunderstood than anything else. But we're also hearing concerns about the financial implications today. But isn't the point, and I think Sally Egan said, we're not starting from scratch here, and isn't that the point, given that midwives and health visitors have a role in the early part of a child's life, essentially a de facto named person already, again, maybe reflecting the point that you made, Ms Mayo, already what's happening in practice, given that presumably where need is identified, that these people can then contact social work or other agencies as is needed. From a policy perspective, and importantly from this committee's perspective, from a financial perspective, isn't the NHS quite ideally placed to help deliver this role of a named person?
Sorry, quite a what?
Sorry?
Sorry, I never caught the last part of what you said.
Isn't the NHS well placed to deliver this role? From not only a policy perspective, but from our committee's perspective, from a financial perspective?
I 100% agree with you. I think the NHS is in the ideal place to capture some of this information if we're truly wishing to sort of implement GIRFIC and the Children's Bill. We need to be able to intervene where it's appropriate to do so as early as possible in the life course, and that means considering both the needs of the unborn child and the mother. If you consider fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, for example, that's entirely preventable and has a huge cost to Scotland as a nation. And we know that if we intervene early enough, we can do an awful lot to prevent that becoming an issue for some of these unborn children. If you look at the need to discuss anything, the substance misuse issue, mental health issues with mums, etc., capturing that as early as possible within the life course is the most effective way of dealing with that. And the early identification of those issues is absolutely critical, and I do not see another agency being in a position to take that forward or to work with parents at that early stage.
Well, that's a shared perspective.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes, I would absolutely support what Jim's saying. I mean, I think health visitors are ideally placed, but I think over the years, and I speak from sort of 20 years experience of managing health visitors prior to the job that I'm currently doing, their caseloads, their case mix has changed significantly. I mean, we've spoke about being the named person, and for the modelling, the financial modelling was based around 20% of children with additional need, but also within their caseloads, though, there will be around, in Lothian it averages about 5% of children who have what we call cause for concern or child protection issues. And currently, the health visitors are having to spend a large proportion of their time with these families and liaising with social work, attending case conference, core group meetings, etc., with a recognition that there are another 15% of children with, you know, additional needs that maybe their needs are not getting met as effectively and there's not as early intervention as we would like, which means that those children, potentially some of them, could end up being in the cause for concern stroke child protection bracket. So it's trying to look at it very holistically and look at the whole pathway for the children. And I think our modelling has been based on the assumption that, yes, health visitors are doing a lot of work at the moment, but what the bill is asking is more than that. There has to be more early intervention. You know, if you look at it in the wider context of the early years framework, there has to be more. And given the size of the current caseloads, which range from 250 to 350, not to 5-year-olds on an average health visitor caseload, how can you be the named person for that number of children, given those percentage ratios of need at the very highly vulnerable end, the sort of additional need end, and the universal end? How do you be all things to all people within that caseload?
And I think that's at the heart of the issue, which is why we are so keen at this point in time to put the spotlight on the health visiting service and say the capacity within the system currently isn't there, but this is such an opportunity for Scotland to grow the health visiting workforce, to be able to deliver the named person service, to be able to deliver that universal assessment and support to every family in Scotland, that this is an opportunity that must be seized now.
Just one final question. Even as a specific question to Ms Egan, because it was, and it's in an entirely different area of the bill. I was intrigued by the point of paragraph 35 and the evidence you provided to us, which related to the duty on public bodies to support on steps taken to further UNCRC, the Convention of the Rights of the Child. And I'm just going to quote you this. I think it's important to put it in the record in terms of the question. You say NHS Lothian recognises that undertaking more robust assessments will result in unidentified needs having to be met. While NHS Lothian staff agree with this in principle, it is expected that additional resources will be required to implement the plans. Lothian is a diverse population with around 90% of the population from ethnic minority backgrounds, and Edinburgh is much higher at around 26%. Although not all of these children and young people will have additional needs, there will be a number who will require interpreters. Consultations take much longer, who may be socially isolated and have increased mental health needs. Therefore, additional resources will be needed to ensure that these children and young people's needs are identified and met that have not been outlined in the current financial memorandum. But these circumstances, the fact that Lothian and Edinburgh in particular have a diverse population and may have groups of young people who require interpreters, they don't come around as a consequence of this bill. So the question is, what happens now? Presumably that service happens just now. Interpreters are provided.
It does happen, but it is a huge, you know, obviously we need to prioritise. It's quite a huge burden, particularly in the antenatal care, getting interpretation services so that, you know, that the women know what's happening during their antenatal care and their labour in particular. You know, again, I think the bill outlines what has to happen within the bill and the financial memorandum to, you know, implement GIRFEC and the named person. But I think for us in Lothian, we have been trying to address the growing need and how to meet the needs of our early years population, because it is a very diverse population. And that's the same, you know, for additional learning within schools. How do we meet the needs of these children? So we need to recognise that. And it's not actually associated per se with the bill, but it is something that we felt very strongly about, and our parent groups, who we also consulted on the bill, felt that we had to get across about our minority ethnic population. We have a very high Polish population, as you know, Eastern European, but all sorts of other populations.
I think that's helpful. I mean, you say it's not related to the bill, but to be fair, in your written evidence, you did say it was related to the bill, but I think that clarification is helpful.
I think as a consequence, we need to make sure that we take account of these populations when we're implementing the named person.
Of course, I don't doubt that, but I suppose the point I'm making is that the evidence you've provided in the written form, you know, that the circumstances don't arise as a consequence of the bill, and you've agreed with that, so that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Gavin?
The largest cost on the NHS as a consequence of this bill is the cost of health visitors and public health nurses for what is described in the financial memorandum as the 20%, so those children with emerging or significant concerns. If you look at 2016-17, which I suppose is the first full year of implementation, out of the £16 million cost to the NHS, 10 million of it is attributed to health visitors and public health nurses for that cohort. So it's 10.2 million in 16-17, but 2 years later, in 18-19, that cost goes from 10.2 million to 5.3 million, almost 50% drop. Not quite 50%, but almost 50% drop in a period of 2 years. Is that credible?
Was one of the significant areas of our written evidence was to say that no, it's not. If the approach is to be effective, there may be a small reduction over time, but currently health visitors have little capacity to engage effectively with families and communities in a way that models the preventative approach. As we've just heard from Sally Egan, most health visiting time is tied up with the families who need their most support, and the preventative approach that is at the heart of getting it right for every child. Health visitors don't have that capacity at the moment. The development of a child's plan requires significant time and coordination, and at the heart of all of this is a relationship with a child and family. Meetings need to be arranged. You know, these things aren't going to reduce year on year at the rate that the financial memorandum models. So if we're going to make a real difference and a lasting difference to families, then that additional health visiting capacity needs to be sustained.
Yeah, I would agree with Claire. I don't think it will reduce significantly, because every year another 10,000 kids are born and come into Lothian, and you have the same percentage ratios with vulnerabilities and additional needs. Maybe, you know, in 10 to 15 years, when we've been really effective with our early intervention and our adult programmes for substance misuse, etc., we will see a changing picture, and health visitors will need to do less. So I think that assumption is probably a bit flawed, actually, and I think the more we've got into discussion post publication of the policy memorandum. I think that's what I'm picking up from my peers across Scotland. I'm the chair of the Scottish Child Health Commissioners Group, and I'm also a member of the group that Claire Mayo referred to, that Rosemary Linus is about to kick off in Scotland around various work streams. And I think the general consensus across the Child Health Commissioners and the Public Health Nursing Advisory Group is that that part of the bill is probably a bit off course in terms of the financial model. You won't see a difference that quick.
I would fully support what's been said. I think the presumption that reduction in funding is going to be appropriate at that time within the process is flawed. I think we need to accept that this is very much a generational approach we have to take to try to turn this around. And we will not see, if I can put it rather crudely, better parents until we've been in this situation for 10, 15 years or so. And at that point in time, we may be then turning the situation entirely around, and we anticipate being able to do so. Where we are struggling is that we don't anticipate the reduction in the number of families or the percentage of families that require intensive intervention coming into play until much later in the life course kind of thing. So we're looking at maybe 7 years' time before we actually see any great impact. If you consider the sort of birth pattern of most of the average family in Scotland kind of thing, most children happen to be born within a 7-year period from your oldest to your youngest. And we have to accept that as the need for intervention will remain with those families over a significant period of time.
Can I just ask you to clarify, Mr. Carley, you had two figures in there. You mentioned 10 to 15 years towards the end of your answer. You mentioned 7 years. Can you just tell me what's going to happen in 7 that won't happen? Sorry, what will happen in 10 or 15 that won't happen in 7? Is it just a gradual process, or is there something significant about it?
It is a gradual process, but we expect to see individual families turning around and being healthier, if I can put it that way, within a 7-year period, because that's roughly the sort of birth profile we're dealing with. When we're dealing with the young people who are being born today, for example, then I meant the sort of 15-year approach kind of thing, when they're heading towards parenthood. And we hope by early intervention to be able to produce better parents in the future.
That's helpful.
Can I just come in, because in terms of a couple of specifics, within paragraph 60 in the financial memorandum, the assumptions made are that by 2018-19, there will be some children born to families with whom the named person is familiar, and therefore there would be a significant reduction. I mean, our belief is that that considerably overstates the level of efficiencies that would be achieved in that way. The other issue in terms of the reduction necessary is that there will be less time dealing with families in crisis. Again, as an assumption, that's a huge assumption, that within 2 years there will be far less families in crisis. There are going to be families in crisis for many years to come. And the other thing is in Table 11, we're looking at the number of hours required in the coming years. There's a new 27 to 30 month check which is being introduced to identify toddlers who are in need of additional support. And to reflect this, the figure for 3-year-olds really needs to remain at 10 hours each year until the cohort who are in the 0 to 1 in 2016-17 reach the age of 3. So you actually allow for the fact that we're picking up toddlers with additional needs now, because this is a new approach. So again, the Table 11 makes a fairly steep reduction in hours over the next 4 years. And again, we would question the assumptions contained within that table.
I mean, just in terms of that table, if I just take maybe an extreme example, in 16-17, the view is that a 4-year-old will need 10 hours additional, but by 17-18, a 4-year-old will only need 4 hours additional. I mean, that strikes me as an extreme drop in a single year. What are your views on that?
I mean, some of this was around that everybody's intervening earlier, so there's more intensive work going on. So by the time the 2-year-olds or 4-year-old, then hopefully you've intervened earlier and there may be a bit of a less intensive intervention needed, you know, than what you would need in, you know, year one of going to full implementation. As I said earlier, the working around this was fairly crude. It was based on what we knew, what our staff were telling us, what we fed back to the GIRFEC team at government. We really don't know. It's an unknown quantity. So this is assumptions that we've made, and I think people need to realise that it's been based on the best sort of anecdotal and data, you know, because we did look at our data, our numbers, etc., that we had at the time. But I think, you know, it's going to be part of an ongoing review process to just look at, are we actually making a difference? And the work of the Early Years Collaborative, there's 3 work streams which we'll be looking at, you know, pre-birth up to a year to 3, and 3 to 5 years. And there's some very high-level targets within that. So we need to look at, are we actually improving outcomes? It's not just about a reduction, because if we're not improving outcomes, we might actually find we need more. That is a very real possibility. And it's all interrelated. You know, if the health visitors assess, they find need that's not been identified previously, they need resources to actually support that family. So will we have enough early years provision for those families that are not looked after children? So, for example, there's going to be additionality for looked after 2-year-olds, but you shouldn't have to become looked after to have that additional intervention. And that's one of the things that worries the health visitors, is they might be picking up a lot of this early intervention and having to intervene as opposed to have other people support them. So it's tied up in the wider picture of what resources are going to be there to support the health visitors to deliver this agenda.
We've looked at the number of hours that have been assumed. The other factor, of course, which affects the price is the hourly rate that is applied. Now, the financial memorandum applies an hourly rate of £19.04 for midwives, for health visitors and for public health nurses. Just specifically Claire Mayo, though, would it be fair to say that an accurate figure from your point of view then would be that £19.04 per hour plus 22.5% that you refer to in your submission? Is that, or is the 19.4, should that be higher as well as the 22%? What's your sort of official RCN position, as it were?
The £19.04 was calculated on the basis, I think, of midpoint of the scale, with national insurance added. The current position, given that 47% of the workforce is over 50, is that most of those people are on the upper end of the pay band. So £19.04 per hour would not accurately reflect what the current workforce are on. And I know Sally Egan in her evidence said that that certainly wouldn't reflect what the current Lothian workforce are on. I suppose we were taking into account the fact that we are looking to recruit a significant number of newly qualified health visitors rapidly, which would take the average figure down, and perhaps the midpoint would be reasonable going forward. But certainly, I agree with Sally, it doesn't reflect what the current health visiting workforce, what the salary bill is, because most of them are at the upper end of that pay spine.
Is it fair to say then that in the early years of this policy, then taking the midpoint isn't going to be correct, whereas down the line
£21 an hour is a more accurate figure of the current post holders within the health visiting workforce.
And just for clarity, though, again from the RCN point of view, if 21 is an accurate figure, is your view as the RCN that it's the actual cost is 21 per hour plus 22.5%, or is it 21? Does that encapsulate?
22.5% is critical, because you can't buy health visiting hours. You actually have to translate those hours into posts, and that's what the 22.5% is about. It's about turning hours into posts. So that's a
I get that, but what I suppose I'm just trying to establish, if you take 21 as a figure, to get an accurate reflection of the cost, do we need to add 22.5% onto that? Okay, thank you. No, that's helpful. Last question, if I may, just the other sort of cost in the table is described as training backfill. 2015-16, there's about £1 million allocated to training backfill. In 16-17, there is approximately £0, and it's £0 for every year after that. The financial memorandum says that training costs will be subsumed in future years. Again, I just wonder, is that a fair assumption, or will there be some? Is it likely there will be some training costs in future years after the initial year?
I mean, I think there will always be training costs. There'll be ongoing training costs because we have staff turnover. It won't perhaps be as intensive training as the initial sort of training, depending on how the bill pans out and what's required. We try to build in training costs to our workforce planning as part of NHS Lothian's financial plan. But I don't think the training costs are going to go away. We will always have to do multi-agency training. I think it will be within a menu of wider training. So we spoke earlier about, I think it was Midlothian colleague earlier, about the CAPSIM training, training for working with parents who've got drug and alcohol. I think it will be part of a wider training package for the whole early years delivery, not specifically to the named person. And we're already developing some modules through LearnPro that staff in both adult services and children's services can use, that gives them the basis of what getting it right for every child is about and what the role of the named person, lead professional, etc. is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin, and that's exhausted the questions from the committee. I'm just wondering if there's any further points that you feel the committee haven't covered that perhaps you'd wish to comment on. You don't have to, but if you so wish, please feel free to do so. Yes?
Just a simple one. It was really in response to your questions to Midlothian colleague earlier. We have actually got a breakdown of the additionality in midwifery and health visiting by the CHPs in Lothian. And for Midlothian, it would be an additional 6 health visitors and 2.5 midwives, if that helps you get a perspective on what does that mean from a staffing population in Midlothian. And we've got the same for the other local authorities that I can give you if you want it.
Yeah, okay, that is very helpful. Ms Mayo or Mr Carroll, anything else to add?
I would just sort of like to reinforce a couple of points that we would strongly of the view that this situation needs to be kept under review, that we would fully accept the need to take on board the burden of making sure we have effective and monitoring evaluation systems in place so we can feed back information accurately to you. But if we are to truly change the culture in Scotland and make this grasp this opportunity, which we believe strongly in, then we need to consider that the need for ongoing investment in early years to achieve the outcomes we're trying to.
Thank you.
Similarly, I think this is a huge opportunity within the Children and Young People Bill to resource a universal health visiting service so that every family in Scotland has a named health visitor who can support them in their role as new parents. It's a huge opportunity, but it must be resourced properly. So I'd really urge the Finance Committee to look really carefully at those figures and ensure that there are the resources behind the bill to really make a difference for families.
Thank you. I don't know if we can ensure the resources there, but we can certainly lobby for those resources to be there. But thank you very much. I appreciate the questions from the committee, but of course the evidence, most importantly, from our witnesses. I'm now going to call another brief recess of 5 minutes or so to allow for the bill team to get into position. Hey folks, I'm going to bring this session back into order. We've got a lot to get through today. I think there's loads and loads of questions that colleagues are quite keen to ask, so we're going to get into more or less straight away. But first of all, I want to invite our third panel of witnesses on the Children and Young People Scotland Bill's financial memorandum, the Scottish Government Bill team, and can I therefore welcome to the committee Mr Tim Barraclough, Mr Scott Mackay and Mr Phil Rains. So very welcome this morning. And I understand that there will be a short opening statement. Mr Barraclough.
Yes. Good morning, Convener. Good morning, Committee. The Children and Young People Scotland Bill forms part of the Government's programme to meet Minister's ambition to make Scotland the best place in the world to grow up. And as you are already well aware, the provisions are many and detailed. The key principles that thread through the bill are early intervention and prevention, the rights of children and young people, putting the child or young person at the centre of services, ensuring that services are designed around them to meet their needs, and the most efficient and effective deployment of public services focused on achieving outcomes. The bill builds on the ever-growing body of expertise, knowledge, understanding and experience relating to the well-being of children and young people, and it is a broad-ranging bill covering a number of related policy areas, some of which are very large and complex. And these include, as you know, measures around children's rights, the Getting It Right for Every Child approach, again designed to help services cooperate and collaborate to meet children's needs, a substantial extension of the free provision of early learning and childcare, and a number of measures to provide further support to looked after children and those in kinship care. Looking today at the financial memorandum, this sets out the government's best estimates at the time of the introduction of the bill earlier this year of the costs of all these measures. In formulating these estimates, we drew on evidence from a wide range of stakeholders who each brought their own different perspective to the task. Accommodating all that evidence and taking into account the uncertainties exist, and then projecting the future impact of these complex measures on a national basis, a Scotland-wide basis, meant that we did have to make a number of assumptions in developing the estimates. And as you've heard, the only true test of those assumptions will come with the implementation of the provisions of the bill. And as I said earlier, this bill builds on approaches and in particular good practice that has been developed over the previous years. Scottish ministers have already made a significant investment in services for children and young people, confident in the long-term benefits, tangible and intangible, that this will bring. They intend to continue with that investment and, as part of the discussions of the funding settlement for future years, have committed to fund fully the additional costs to local authorities arising from the bill. That's all I have to say. And just say the team here are happy to take any questions you have on the bill and its financial
Thank you very much for that opening statement, Mr Barraclough. So, as is normally the case, I'll start with a few questions and we'll open out the session to colleagues round the table. Just take you first to the executive summary from SPICE, which says the majority of costs, around 90% on average, fall on local authorities, and according to COSA, the Scottish Government has committed to fully funding the requirements of the bill in respect of their impact on local authorities. Does that remain the case? Because what we have is a number of potential circumstances where costs will go beyond what is in the financial memorandum. So I'm just wondering if there are contingencies to ensure that that is indeed the case.
I think the position is that the government has promised to fully fund the additional costs. As I said, the financial memorandum represents our estimate of additional costs as of earlier this year. Of course, more information will come out both now and as we go forward towards implementation of the measures. And I think the government will be committed to ensuring that additional costs, as they do arise, are properly assessed and funded as appropriate. Scott, I think.
Yeah, it will be taken forward as part of the ongoing discussions between ministers and local government in negotiating the settlement.
Yes, because I mean we had a letter obviously from Minister Aileen Campbell who talked about additional monies for extending early learning and childcare to 2-year-olds, some additional 3.4 million to a total of 4.5 million, and also an estimate of 1.2 million for updating partner provided payments to 2 million. I'm just wondering how there has been such a differential in between 1.1 million and 4.5 million, for example, in the original estimates. It seems quite a difference.
But the original estimate sets out our assessment of the additional hours required for looked after 2-year-olds. What the letter that you've received refers to is the overall funding position for looked after 2-year-olds in its entirety. So at the moment there's an element of funding that that flows through the early year change fund to local government, and in arriving at the 4.5 million figure, what ministers have sought to do is to address overall costing issues with the provision for looked after 2-year-olds in its entirety, rather than the additional hours which are set out in the financial memorandum.
Okay. Now, in terms of the methodology, what's been suggested is that the basis for many of these assumptions is unclear in the financial memorandum. A number of organisations, including COSLA and individual local authorities, have questioned their basis. I just wonder if you can talk to us through a wee bit more about how some of the assumptions were derived at, because clearly you'll have heard the evidence this morning, and there's quite a difference in opinion in terms of how these assumptions will actually work in reality.
I think in general terms, it's fair to say that the availability of base evidence is quite variable across the range of policy areas that the bill covers. And what we tried to do was get the best estimates that we could, and those were tested quite extensively, particularly with COSLA, but also with other stakeholders. We had a series of meetings where we went through the assumptions that we were making on costs and testing them against the information that they could provide at the time. I don't know if there's any further.
It might be helpful to actually pick up on the specific assumptions, because each set of assumptions we will have arrived at in different ways. We may have tested in different ways. At the end of the day, we have to provide the cost estimate. So we use the best information we can for developing a national picture. And I would stress the national picture. Clearly, with some of the assumptions, with some of the costs, in developing national averages, you wouldn't expect every local area would fit with that national average exactly. I mean, we heard earlier today from Alistair Gow at Edinburgh City Council, and I'm sure we'll be coming on to discussions about the kinship care order. And his position may reflect what goes on in Edinburgh. We have to take the evidence that suggests what the national picture may be. Now, there are issues about how that funding goes to local areas, but that's a subsequent issue, which we can discuss as well.
Why, in terms of national issues, is, for example, the issue which was raised by the Royal College of Nurses, things like costing for office space, travel expense, administrative support, consumables, predicted absence, etc., not been included, and what consideration has been taken into account in terms of the capacity, for example, in terms of health visit numbers, which was an issue we've obviously discussed with the previous panel?
In developing the health visitor numbers, or indeed the health visitor capacity, I guess there are two sets of issues there. One is, what are our assumptions about what the additional workloads would be? And the second of all is, we obviously have to look at what current experience is and have to test out those assumptions, particularly in the issue of GERFIC, because as has been often said at this committee and elsewhere, GERFIC is, there is a significant experience, a significant tradition of implementing GERFIC, and therefore there's experience to draw upon. Now, in terms of the administration costs, it is, I think traditionally in calculating things associated with health visitors, many of the calculations regarding administration costs are subsumed within the general cost of health visitors more generally. It's a distinction that's from the way that the local authority costs are provided. In terms of consumables and accommodation, I'm not sure what kind of costs we'd be talking about, but the key costs, I think, with regard to the health visitors, with regard to the way that the NHS would be carrying out its duties with regard to GERFIC, really it kind of arises from the staff costs, the relationship that the health visitors, the midwives, are going to have with the individuals, the individual children, the individual families, and the way that they can then relate or coordinate any issues arising, particularly for the 18 to 20% of children with particular concerns with other professionals.
But what's your response to the comment by NHS Lothian that we do not think we can meet these costs within our current financial allocation, nor do we think there's capacity within the health visiting workforce in Scotland to respond within the timeline? And what they've said is that the bill assumptions are wholly unrealistic in terms of this issue.
Well, there's a couple of sets of issues there. In terms of whether they can meet it within their existing capacity, within their existing financial settlement, the financial memorandum stands testament to the fact that we think there's a need for some form of additional capacity, some form of additional costs that arises. Now, how that's to be met is really a discussion that would need to take place with NHS health boards, taking into account the existing capacity of the existing health visitor workforce and how that may need to expand over time. With regard to the assumptions, we're happy to go through the specific assumptions which underlie the costing for this, but a lot of time and work has gone into devising those assumptions and thinking through. And indeed, if I might say, the underlying principle behind those assumptions is the idea of early intervention. It's working on the basis that if you intervene in a child or family's life at an early stage where trouble might be starting to happen, you're going to be saving costs further down the line. And we did spend, I noticed that some of the discussion in the last session was revolving around Table 11, and I'm happy to go through that, but much of the assumptions around Table 11 are working on the basis that if you're having a more intensive intervention than is currently the case with 0 to 1-year-olds, then that 0 to 1-year-olds, as they get older, with in the following year, you wouldn't expect there necessarily to be the same level of intervention because you have intervened early, because you've taken the steps that are necessary to stop that kind of those kind of problems arising. So you would expect that early intervention would lead to maybe less time being spent year on year.
Yes, but not the precipitous reduction that is in the matter. I mean, what people who are working in the coalface who are actually dealing with some of these children are basically saying, yes, there will be significant improvements, but not over a couple of years or 2 or 3 years, over a much longer period of time. And their concern is that the figures are not realistic in their experience in terms of being able to deliver the kind of savings that you're talking about over a very short period of time. And that would obviously lead 2 or 3 years after the bill has been implemented to significant funding shortfalls.
To some extent, I'm a bit surprised by that, because you would expect that if you look at Table 11, the 0 to 1-year-olds in the first year it's listed there. I get the tables in front of me for 2016 to 17. The 0 to 1-year-olds for whom you've put in, and this is an additional 10 hours. This is not what every health visitor should be spending on those kids with emerging and significant concerns at the moment, but this is what we'd expect to be done additionally. You'd expect that to bear some fruit as those 0 to 1-year-olds in the following year, 2017 to 18, become 1-year-olds. And there, the assumption is that the 10 hours you've invested on average, because some will require far more intensive work than others, would bear fruit, and that you wouldn't need to have as an intensive investment of health visitor time as you go forward.
I mean, even if you look at that graph, why 0 to 1? Why is it 10 hours in 16, 17, and 17, 18, and then go down to 8? You know, I mean, why is there assumed to be a 20% reduction in need for newborn children, for example? Yeah.
Because we'd expect as the health visitor role gets bedded in over time, and particularly as the role of the midwives at the pre-birth stage is much more active, we would expect there to be savings developed, that basically as GERFEC becomes if I could use the expression, the air that services breathe, which is what all the provisions in this bill are trying to do, you expect over a couple of years that you wouldn't need to have as intensive an involvement from the early stages. You still require quite significant involvement, and that's reflected in the 8 hours that you get from 18, 19 onwards.
I'll let my colleagues in just in a minute because they're all quite keen to come in. I just want to ask one further question of the panel, which is with regard to nursery provision, and you'll probably have heard the National Day Nurses Association Inez Murray's comments, and you'll seen her submission where she says in paragraph 15, we're not confident that partner providers of early learning and childcare can meet the costs associated with the bill unless measures are taken by government to ensure sufficient funding is allocated to local authorities and actually reaches providers in the form of a viable hourly rate for high quality provision for children. And you'll have heard, of course, that some authorities have been quite naughty in terms of actually passing on some of this funding. What are you going to do to ensure that this funding is realistic and indeed is delivered directly by local authorities to these partnership nurseries?
The bill does not provide for a mechanism for local authorities to pass on this to partner providers, and ultimately different arrangements occur in different local authority areas between local authorities and their partner providers, and at the moment government policy is not to dictate to local authorities exactly how they spend their money. It's to provide within the overall envelope of their single outcome agreement. So there is no specific proposal that we can put forward or would have in place to say that, yes, there would be some kind of ring fencing that would force local authorities to pass them on to partner providers.
I mean, indeed, but you can't therefore really guarantee, of course, that what you're actually trying to achieve through this bill is going to be achieved if indeed, local authorities don't actually pass on money to those who are actually going to have to deliver it in the sharp end.
We are putting an obligation on local authorities to make sure that there is the provision of the 600 hours early learning and childcare available. Again, it's up to local authorities how they deliver on that obligation, but we would expect them to deliver on that obligation properly, and we will provide the funding for them, help them to do that.
Without, further duties, though, is it not the case that some local authorities are likely to be, how should we put this diplomatically, much more supportive of the bill's aims than others, and you might find, therefore, a significant difference in terms of delivery across the country?
Local authorities also be under a duty to report on how they've delivered all of their children's services, and that is a matter which then will become part of public information. I don't think we're in a position here to say whether or not local authorities, what position they will take in respect of implementing the bill. What we can say is the bill will be requiring them to undertake a number of duties. The provision of the early learning childcare hours is one of them, and we would expect them to do that.
I'm going to open the session out to colleagues. Michael, to be followed by Jamie.
As in the same area, these assumptions that you're making, and Mr Barraclough, you said in your opening comments that the only true test will come with implementation. That's a given, I think. I mean, we won't entirely know, but there are best estimates, there are educated guesses, there's evidence from abroad that when you want to invest in prevention, that there's an initial cost which has to be met if you're going to achieve the outcomes that you ultimately want to see being produced. But the evidence that we've had in submissions to this committee, the evidence that I've received in talking to people about their perceptions of the bill, is that the assumptions that you're working on don't meet with the general concept of preventative spend. That you're taking, for example, foster care. The provision of that at the moment is so far behind the curve that even to invest more in that would fall way short of what's required to achieve the outcomes that you're predicting in the financial memorandum. So if the assumptions that you're working on are flawed from the outset, you can't possibly achieve the predictions that are in this financial memorandum. Is that not the case?
I think all I can say to that is that we have provided, and a number of the evidence that we have seen says the Scottish Government has provided the best estimates that are available at the time of the introduction of the bill, and in terms of the provisions that are in the bill. There are wider issues about whether we can achieve all of our Minister's policy aims, and the bill is only part of a much wider programme of policy programmes to deliver better outcomes for children and young people. And there may be a range of other measures that might need to be taken in order to support what the bill is contributing to achieve. But I think we would say that we have actually gone through quite a rigorous process of finding the best evidence that there is available, and it is patchy in places and non-existent in other places. We have made some assumptions on how this will play out over time. These are estimates that, of course, will could always be looked at again in the light of further evidence coming back from as authorities and health boards prepare for and then implement the provisions. But I would say that these are the best estimates that we could put together at the time.
The best estimates of the evidence we have from NHS boards, the best estimates from children's charities, the best estimates from local government bodies, the best estimates from foster care organisations, the best estimates of all these organisations say that your best estimates are wrong. Somebody's getting it wrong. Why are you right and all these other organisations wrong? They're looking at good evidence that they have, evidence from their experience, evidence from comparable investments in other jurisdictions. So why are they wrong? All of these organisations are wrong, but your best estimate is right.
I'm not saying all organisations are all wrong. There have been, as I said in my opening statement, we got a wide range of submissions from a wide range of stakeholders, some of whom were saying quite different things. And we have to take our best judgment of which of those are ones that need to be incorporated in an estimate of the additional cost of the bill, which ones need to be thought about or looked at in future in the light of further evidence. As I say, at the moment, we have gathered together, and this is not just evidence generated internally within the Scottish Government, it's in consultation with a number of these stakeholders, and in particular, COSLA, there's, as I said, a very intensive going through all of the provisions that relate to local authorities. And a number of the evidence that we've seen has suggested that some of these estimates are, or these estimates are as good as they can be in the light of the evidence available.
We have taken the steps that we can to test the assumptions that we've made with key stakeholders in arriving at the figures that we've put in the financial memorandum.
And all of the evidence to substantiate your position is all available?
Well, there's the financial memorandum sets out where where the government has placed its judgment. A number of the evidence was obviously, of course, in sort of meetings and also all these submitted evidence to the government as part of the consultation process. Those are all, some of that will be available, some of it will be just, as I say, the fact that we sat down with people like COSLA and worked through them, the estimates that have been produced.
I might also just add that it's not as if all of this is new. Some of you talk about the preventative spend and the approach that's been taken. Some of the areas of the bill are new. Kinship care, there's no real precedent for that. So we're having to do our best guess about when making the assumptions and work out as and when the savings kick in. GIRFEC, there's a lot of experience. GIRFEC, we're able to draw on people who have actually gone a long way down the road of GIRFEC. So we have an understanding about the kind of savings that are going to be made, the kind of experience that staff are going to have in developing it and taking it forward, and the kind of timescales over which it might take place.
Strange that organisations that are involved in GIRFEC are saying that your estimates are all wrong.
City Council.
Yeah, okay.
So, and indeed not Highland, many of the areas which have actually been taking forward GIRFEC perhaps most actively. Those who maybe haven't taken it forward as actively, they obviously would have more concerns and more uncertainty over how it might operate in their areas.
Okay. Okay, Jamie to be followed by John.
Actually, the area I wanted to explore, Convener, you've already raised. I think you've usefully explored, but so I have no questions at this time.
Okay, then John to be followed by Gavin.
Okay, thanks. I mean, maybe following on from what Michael McMahon was saying, I mean, there was a number of words used in the previous answers, like best estimates, best guesses, words like that. I mean, would it be fair to say that this is such a major bill, and I think everybody's actually welcoming the intentions of the bill, that we're really going into largely unknown territory, for example, kinship care. And frankly, neither yourselves nor the previous witnesses have really any clear idea as to the needs, the costs, the demand, any of that. Is that not basically where we're at?
To take the example of kinship care, I'm not sure if that's the case. It is a best guess estimate. It's a new policy area. We don't have any obvious precedents. It's not like, for example, the through care and aftercare proposals where you have some understanding about how that operates at the moment for 19 to 21-year-olds, and you can make some assumptions which can be reasonably tested about how that would be applied up to 25 or 26, though obviously there may be differences of opinion about how they're applied. Kinship care is different. But the logic, I think, of the kinship care model and the proxies, if I can use that, on which we've actually drawn the estimates are, I mean, we would stand by them. I mean, the kinship care order operates on a very simple principle, which is that if you can get one child out of kinship care for 1 year, you can save about £9,000. And the bill tries to do that in 3 ways. It does it through the kinship care order, which is effectively an existing instrument, a Section 11 order under the 1995 Act with some modifications, to entice those people on kinship care to move across to a less expensive way of achieving permanence for children. It also tries to achieve it by, if you will, kind of diverting those children who might be in formal care and those children in families where crisis might be emerging through family counselling measures to avoid going into care. And we've drawn those estimates from the best evidence that's available. With regard to, I know that Alistair and others had talked about the assumptions that went into trying to predict the numbers. And again, that is tricky business, trying to work out what numbers are going to go forward. But it would seem reasonable if you're looking at something which is a variation of an existing instrument, a Section 11 order, to look at the way that Section 11 orders have been taken up to date. And the estimates, you can drive estimates for that about the number of kinship carers who come forward, the number of informal carers that come forward. And the estimates for that suggest that it is quite, relatively speaking, quite low numbers. So we've added to those estimates. We've suggested that maybe a higher percentage of those people will be coming forward. But we have actually drawn from the national data that's available and looked at the experience of people who've tried to seek permanence in using the existing instruments.
I mean, to some extent, I mean, I don't disagree with all you say, but I mean, you actually increase my worries when every time you use words like best available, which, you know,
a piece of saying.
Well, exactly. And, you know, I mean, you've argued the case for how this is better for one child, but I think we're all convinced that this is better for one child. I think our questions at this committee are more about how many children are out there, how many are in informal kinship care, and all my impression from the witnesses we've had so far is that is extremely uncertain, very vague, and the numbers. So, I mean, I think I'm past convincing now that there are any certain numbers out there at all. So I think my next question then is, what is the review process in place for, you know, if a local authority or the local NHS or whoever it is finds that things are quite different from what was expected, how quickly is that going to be fed through to government? How quickly will there be a review of the figures?
It depends on the different parts of the provisions of the bill, but to take the looked after children, there's going to be a key element of liaison going on between local government, between Scottish Government and local government and key stakeholders in the development of the regulations that go around this. And the regulations will be, I think, be key to how things like the kinship care order, through care and after care are taken forward, because they're going to be setting out the types of support that might be available, the time span over which it might legitimately be offered, and the tests that will be available for being able to for applying to people who wish to be considered for the kinship care order or through care and after care. So there's a process, I think, through developing that would enable some feedback to carry on. And that feedback will continue as the, particularly for the relevant teams within the Scottish Government, will be working with stakeholders in terms of implementing that. In terms of GIRFEC, there is already a very active engagement that goes on between the Scottish Government and the relevant team and the implementation of GIRFEC across the country. It's been going on for years now. I mean, the Scottish Government's put something like, I'm saying this off the top of my head, but I know it's in the financial memorandum, but something like 7.8 million to 8 million pounds in engaging with stakeholders to get that sense of what are the issues, what are the problems. We have a program board that's set up, which is composed of Scottish Government and stakeholders, whose job it is indeed to monitor and keep an eye on assessment of implementation. So these mechanisms for feeding back how the policy is being put in practice, where the problems are emerging, and indeed what the resource implications of that are going to be already in place. But they are different for different parts of the bill.
Okay. I mean, in a previous answer, I think it was yourself, Mr. Rains, said that if there's a need for more health visitors, that's a matter for health boards. I mean, again, that concerns me that it seems very uncertain. We've had previous evidence as to actually how many health visitors would be needed. adding on cover for holidays, all that kind of thing, and whether actually they can be trained in time for all of this.
We're talking about implementing by 2016 to 17, and we've costed and actually set out the timescales for how the implementation should go forward. I mean, in terms of, there's two things I would say. One is, this is established practice within the NHS. I mean, the Chief Executive Letter, number 29, I believe, made this very clear that GERFEC should be implemented across the NHS. Hall 4 made very clear that this was a very important part of the roles of health visitors and key health staff going forward. So it's not as if a lot of this is new. There should be quite a significant awareness of GERFEC and the issues going forward. But in terms of calculating what might be required, in a sense, what we can do is we can calculate where the gap is. We can calculate what the additional requirement will be needed to take forward these duties. How health boards choose to do it is partly a discussion that health boards need to have with national government centrally anyway, but it's also going to be about how each individual health board will be taking it forward, because they'll all be at different places. They'll all be starting from different points in implementing GERFEC. So it's kind of difficult at this point to be able to say exactly how they'll be going forward, which areas might need a significant expansion in the number of health visitors, which areas might have already implemented the named person to a significant extent, and then maybe the changeover might not be as large as it might be for others.
And if I could just ask one other area, which is to do with the nurseries. I mean, we had evidence already. I think there's a figure of 409 is the suggested figure per hour. However, we also heard that Glasgow was paying 272, and we heard that the actual costs might be up about 451 or thereabouts. I mean, is the government, is there just no involvement from the government in that? Is that just entirely left to local authorities how that works? And if nurseries were to close, say, that would just be one of these things?
Right. Yeah. At the moment, yeah. I mean, that is it is a matter between local authorities to arrange for the provision of the early learning and childcare. So it's not something we would we are currently in a process of getting involved in.
Thank you.
Gavin.
Can we go back to the cost to the NHS, which we focused on in the previous session? We had evidence from 2 health boards and from the Royal College of Nursing, who basically, when asked, are the cost estimates credible, all of them said no. So specifically, the cost for the 20%, if you like, is 10.2 million in 16-17, but it drops to 5.3 million 2 years later in 18-19. Can you explain to us how you arrived at what is close to a 50% drop over a 2-year period?
The majority of that will be in the reduction in staff costs. I'll call up the table in question.
Table 13, basically the bottom, bottom line.
Well, the most significant reduction is clearly in the role of health visitors with regard to those children who require the most needs. And I think if you look at that, I mean, what that table is based on is, in effect, Table 11. It's the reduction in the number of hours that we would estimate that those health visitors would need to spend with 0 to 5-year-olds, which we believe is a reflection of the impact of early intervention, that the intensive work you put in at the start of the rollout of the named person, so for example, the 0 to 1-year-olds receiving quite intensive support in the year 16-17, by the time you get to 19-20, our estimate is that they won't require as much intensive support, and that reflects, that's reflected in that tapering effect.
The evidence we heard, though, from health organisations was that was simply incorrect, and that you wouldn't get anywhere like that drop in 2 years. They suggested it would be 7 years, or in some cases 10 to 15 years. So how do you reach the view that you can drop it so dramatically, so quickly?
I refer back to the answer I gave to the convener, which is, if you look at Table 11, it's based on the assumption that if you have a significantly more intensive and additional support for 0 to 1-year-olds in year 1 of the rollout of the bill, as those 0 to 1-year-olds get older, they become the 1-year-olds of the following year, the 2-year-olds of the year after that, they don't require as much investment. They don't require as much, I mean, on average. Clearly some will require quite intensive investment all the way through. But the impact that you've had of getting in early, of ensuring that the problems, it's the whole principle of the named person, that the problems that people wouldn't necessarily have been spotting can actually be addressed much quicker. You would expect that to be reflected pretty immediately, actually. You'd expect it for, on average, for a lot of those kids, there to be benefits that you would see the year after as they go older. If there was no change whatsoever, if you were having intensive intervention in a child's life at the age of 1, and yet by, the age of 5 or 6, you're still having as intensive an intervention, while that may be true for some children, if it was true for all those 18 to 20%, it would suggest that the operation of the named person, the whole ethos of early intervention, is maybe questionable. You'd expect there to be some kind of gain as a child goes through their life of intervening in those first couple of years.
Experts we heard from said you would expect gain, but the gains initially would be small and over time they would be larger. Do you not think the experts we heard from understood Table 11?
They may well have understood Table 11. We have tested these we've tested these assumptions with those areas which have really gone very far forward with GERFEC. I mean, places like the Highland, which is developed in Pathfinder, and those assumptions to us are reasonable. We've tested it with those managers who are responsible for taking forward the implementation of GERFEC across the NHS health boards, and the feedback we've got from them is that those are not unreasonable assumptions.
Okay, so you've taken it with NHS health boards, but the NHS health boards that spoke to us said that you were wrong. Can you just tell me then, who are the key stakeholders that disagree with what we heard this morning?
I would suggest that those people who've been furthest forward in taking forward GERFEC, which would be areas like the Highland, and I would suggest that those health boards, those groups are maybe most closely associated with the rollout of GERFEC within each of the individual health boards, which would be the relevant GERFEC implementation group. I believe it's called the Cell 29 Managers Group.
Your view is that Highland would agree with you. Which other key stakeholders would agree with you?
We would suggest that Highland, being the most furthest advanced, would be the best placed and the most experienced to be able to comment on whether the assumptions are realistic, because they wouldn't be looking at that speculatively.
Okay, but
other areas
which other stakeholders would agree with you?
Well, I've set out the areas that we've spoken to.
Okay, just for clarity, was the Highland example based on 100 children?
It's a Highland example based on 100 children.
Yeah.
The Highland example is based on the 2006 to 9 Pathfinder, where they developed it, and it was taking forward the rollout across the region as a whole.
Okay. All right, let's leave that. But for clarity, the only stakeholder you can name that agrees with you is Highland.
And those managers who are responsible for taking forward GERFEC within across the NHS health boards.
Okay, but we heard from NHS health boards earlier who put forward the contrary view. So where is the evidence from these managers that you describe?
There are going to be contrary views about this.
We are drawing
on the experience of those people who've actually implemented GERFEC or are closely associated with GERFEC. Other experience, other views will come to bear.
Okay, but this is quite important. What you're saying to the committee is the views that we heard from NHS health boards, the official NHS health board view, is not the same as NHS managers.
I'm not sure if that would count as the official NHS view. I imagine there are a range of different views about taking forward, because, as has been often pointed out, this is quite a complex area. This is requiring basis of looking at assumptions and to a large extent testing it on the way that it's been rolled out by those who've, if you will, pioneering the approach across Scotland.
I don't want to dwell on the point, but do you see my issue? That we have formal submissions, written submissions to this parliamentary committee from NHS health boards who we then questioned. So in my view, that is the NHS health board official view. You're saying to me you've got evidence from others within the NHS who disagree, and I'm asking you, where is that? As a parliamentary committee, we cannot just take the word of somebody saying, this is what other people think. There is a process where we look at the evidence and we have to analyse it and make decisions upon it. And so my question is, where is the evidence that supports the view that you've just put forward?
Come back to talking about the basis on which we drew the estimates. And the basis we drew the estimates was largely based on the experience of those areas which have pioneered taking forward GERFEC. It was based on assumptions about the way that the early intervention would kick in. And I have to say, I haven't heard evidence that was presented to us that specifically challenges that. It's just that they would see it, the gains being developed over, I think one expression was 7 or 15 years. I think for an individual child's life, I would find that surprising on average. And we tested those assumptions out with a specific group who were responsible for taking forward the implementation of GERFEC. So that's the basis on which we derived those costs.
Okay, there's another issue I want to explore. I'm not satisfied with that response, but I won't dwell on it because I feel we're not going forward. The other issue I did want to focus on is the costs on local authorities in relation to GERFEC. The submission there, or the government view is that the cost in additional teacher staffing time in the first year will be £7.814 million. But for every year after that, the cost will be nil. There will be no cost at all for any local authority for this. Can you explain how you reached that conclusion?
Yes. The assumption is that for the first year, there would need to be a specific rollout of training around the named person and the child's plan. The financial memorandum sets out the staff that we think would be involved and the backfilling ratios, as well as the costs for the actual how we think the development of materials might take place and what have you. For every year thereafter, we are assuming, and as we've tested out with a number of stakeholders, that it would be integrated into existing continuous professional development, as is the case, for example, with the training that takes place for ASL needs and what have you under the Additional Support for Learning Act. If you look at some of the training that teachers are required to do on an annual basis, for example, child protection, when you have a named person in place, that child protection training changes quite significantly because the way that child protection will be taken forward would significantly change. So we would imagine that rather than the named person training being added to the existing complement of continuous professional development that local authorities and educational staff in particular would require, we would imagine that their existing CPD courses would need to change to, in effect, kind of integrate how the named person should operate. Because the named person is not a role that stands separate from what teachers do, from what health visitors do. A lot of it, in fact, the heart of it, is based on the existing way that they should be taking things forward. A lot of it is based on around ideas of child protection, for example. So the way that child protection training is taken forward should be taking into account that named person training.
Okay. So the question I have, though, is that you're saying it's going to, forget about training for 1 minute, just the actual implementation of the 3.5 hours required per child for the 10% cohort. You're saying it's going to cost 7.8 million to implement in year 1, but it's not going to cost anything in year 2. You've tested this with stakeholders and so on. Mm-hmm. And the stakeholder that's got the largest number of mentions across the government bill team so far has been COSLA. You've road tested your assumptions with them. Mm-hmm. We've done intensive, I think was the expression used, work with COSLA. So I then read the COSLA submission in relation to this area of staff costs, and what COSLA say. This assumption is speculative, that there'll be no costs in year 2. Basically assumes that it can be saved from elsewhere in the system to accommodate. The COSLA view is that the cost identified for staff time should be funded on a recurring basis. They go on to say later that it is not the experience of some local authorities that implementing GERFEC is reducing the number of meetings or administration. So you've relied heavily on COSLA in reaching your assumptions, but they reach a polar opposite view from the bill team, saying it should be recurring, and you're saying it should be nil.
I would say we relied heavily on COSLA for the assumptions. I think what we said was that we were in intensive discussion with COSLA about it, and we worked with COSLA on whether we could develop a methodology or a way of being able to calculate the costs and the benefits that arose from GERFEC. And I think COSLA, certainly in the statements that have been made, I believe into committee yesterday before the Education and Culture Committee, have admitted that this is a very difficult, complex area. So I don't think this is a suggestion that there's an alternate methodology, a better way of necessarily doing it. They just recognize the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty about it, and certainly that some of COSLA's members would maybe challenge the basis on which those figures have been derived. We've derived those assumptions, those estimates, on the basis of those areas which have been taking forward GERFEC. So that will necessarily be a smaller number of areas. The areas in particular that we've been working with are obviously Highland, but also Edinburgh City Council. And you notice that Alistair Gow, in an area that has been quite active in taking forward GERFEC, did not seem to have significant concerns with those assumptions. We've tested it out with other areas such as Fife, Angus, South Ayrshire, what have you.
And all of those areas agree that the cost would be nil in year 2 onwards?
If I can just draw your attention to Edinburgh's written evidence, which does state that the Council believes the costs for children's rights, GERFEC, early learning, childcare and other proposals are accurately reflected based on our understanding of the requirements of the legislation.
Yes, but you've got one council saying that, and you've got COSLA, who represent all the councils, taking the polar opposite view. So my question is, what other councils are saying the cost is going to be nil? Because it does seem counterintuitive.
I think in the submissions, I believe you received submissions from Falkirk, from Fife, from South Ayrshire. They're all ones, I'm not sure if you've got one from Angus, possibly not from Angus, but Angus was one of the ones we spoke to. But certainly the other 3 I mentioned, if memory serves from the briefing, while I believe Falkirk may have drawn attention to our estimate with regard to the number of hours per child on average, the 3.5 hour. I don't believe the other 3 necessarily contested the underlying assumption about the way that savings kick in relatively quickly.
Okay, but to be clear, your view is that all the other councils that have submitted evidence think that a cost of 0 for year 2 onwards is accurate.
We take the view that those people who've had experience in actually implementing GERFEC in the ways that the bill are proposing, they have views that we would give significant weight to, because they're the people who have actually been at the front line. They've seen how it works in practice. So we would naturally, I guess, take a line quite strongly from the way that they've, from their experience in taking forward GERFEC.
Okay, finally then, so if a majority of councils then held the opposite view, would you then change your assumptions on the funding that would flow through the bill?
We have to take the view that basically on the basis of the estimates we made, we have to draw it from a logical basis. If they are able to put forward a series of arguments that clearly undermine the basis we've done, as opposed to just they don't agree, I think there has to be something a lot more substantive than that, then clearly we would want to look back at the assumptions, and I think we remain open to, because it is a difficult area, all the areas, well, a number of the areas in the bill are quite difficult ones to estimate, so I think we would certainly remain open to that discussion going forward. But again, I think we'd want to test that out against those people who've actually had the real experience in being able to taking forward the implementation of GERFEC, as opposed to a speculative, if I put it that way, concern about what it might be like in their area on the basis of what they think implementation might actually involve.
Can I just add there, I mean, this is something that we would obviously, GERFEC is already being rolled out across the country now. And as Mr. Raine says, that there is a GERFEC implementation program board which is monitoring the implementation of GERFEC and actually trying to assess what it is taking to do that, and it will get back evidence on how that is working across the country. So I think we wouldn't want to change any assumptions on financial estimates just on the basis of submissions without a good deal of appropriate evidence that actually can demonstrate where those costs are rising. But as I said right at the beginning, the government has said that it will fund fully the cost to local authorities, and that will have to be a matter that is under review as we go forward with the implementation of the provisions. But we should be getting a lot more information as we get closer to the implementation of the bill, not just through the GERFEC Implementation Programme Board, but also through information that we will get as we develop the regulations as well. It's a constantly changing picture, and funding decisions obviously will have to depend on the information that is available at the time, and that information will be moving on from the point at which the financial memorandum was produced.
Thanks very much, Gavin. That concludes the questions from committee members, but not myself. I've still got a few I want to ask, and a couple of ones just to follow up from what Gavin's actually been asking about. In terms of the kind of one-off costs that Gavin touched on, the Association of Head Teachers and Deputies in Scotland said, and I quote, "We are unconvinced that the training costs identified are adequate for successful implementation of this legislation." And COSLA commented that the suggestion that the ongoing training can be absorbed into CPD is unrealistic. So, I mean, they're actually saying that to go from 7.8 million to zero can't happen. So surely these are quite significant bodies, Association of Head Teachers and Deputies and COSLA.
And go back to those people who've actually implemented GERFIC. I mean, Alistair Gall did not seem to have issues about the idea that there would be a recurring significant additional cost. And Edinburgh City has taken that forward, I think. I mean, I imagine a national body will be required to reflect the diversity of views that are coming forward. And some of those views will be those folk who will not necessarily know how the GERFIC training will be put into practice. Others of those other views are people who've actually had experience in doing it. They can say this is how it works.
It does seem, as Gavin has said, counterintuitive, though, that this can just be squeezed into addition to existing training at absolutely no costs, including, for example, materials or time or expense. I mean, I just can't see how it can be zero. I mean, if you'd said it was 7.8 million down to 2 million or 1 million, people would have thought, well, okay, fair enough. But zero, I mean, it's very difficult, I think, for me personally to accept that as a realistic sum of money, you know, from one year to the next.
Well, in terms of the development of materials, that's something which have already largely been done, and I think we would be sort of tweaking them in-house. So I think there's a significant...
They get upgraded, they get placed, you know, I mean, they don't last forever. So there clearly has to be some budgetary...
That would be true for any, I imagine, for any training that would be taken forward.
In terms of another point, you talked about Highland, and I think there's a lot of eggs being put into the Highland basket, and I understand that is well, but how can you extrapolate necessarily what's happening in Highland, for example, with somewhere like Glasgow, where socio-economic difficulties are on a much more massive scale, and you know, you get communities that are very deprived, which you don't have to the same level of scale in Highland, and therefore one would expect it to be much more difficult to tackle.
Fair point, and it's one of the reasons why the assumptions have been tested out a variety of other areas which represent quite different types of communities, quite different kind of makeups of the kind of children and young people's population. So again, we have Edinburgh City, we have places like Falkirk and Fife, we have South Ayrshire, all areas which have a mix of rural, urban, of areas of quite significant deprivation, other areas that maybe don't quite experience the same level of concern. Now that's not the same necessarily of Glasgow, but that duplicates, or at least has many of the same sort of issues that Glasgow would be facing, and being able to take forward those kind of that sort of implementation of GERFIC.
Capital costs are something which hasn't come up at all this morning from anyone, so I thought I'd just throw it in, given the fact to round off some of our deliberations. And capital costs have been estimated at 30 million over 3 years, which seems a very round figure. I'm always suspicious of figures. When you say 7.8.135 million, I think work's been done there, but when you say 20 million or 30 million, I often think there's a guess here. And East Renfrewshire Council have noted that, and I quote, "There is not much detail on how the total capital of £30 million per year for 2014-17 has been determined." So I'm just wondering if you can give us a wee bit of information on how the capital costs have been arrived at.
Yes, and I think the starting point is there's very little base evidence or a baseline from which we can draw an assumption about what the increase required as a result of the bill will be in terms of infrastructure. So the capital costs are based on the current Scottish Futures Trust metrics that have been used in the Schools for the Future programme. So we've made an assumption based on those metrics about what additional infrastructure may be needed. We do not have a baseline survey of what infrastructure is currently in place. And of course, one of the other things is in which way local authorities will actually decide to increase capacity where capacity is needed. Will it be new build, or will it be adjustments to or additions to existing capital assets? So we talked to Scottish Futures Trust and those responsible for the Futures Trust initiative. It is a relatively rough and ready proxy for the capital infrastructure that might be needed. It's the primary school metric that gives you an allowance of 7.5 square metres a child at a cost of 2,350 a square metre. So if you apply this to a new unit for 40 children, that would equate to about £700,000. That can vary depending on the size of the unit. If you double that up to 80 children, that's 1.4 million. So we talked about 30 million per annum. That would enable around up to 60 new standalone units, if that's the way local authorities choose to increase their capacity nationally. This is something that, as I say, you're probably right. It's not an assumption or an estimate based on a thorough and detailed assessment, authority by authority, of what exists currently and what they might want to put into place, because that evidence is just simply not available. So this is one of the areas where it is a best guess.
Would councils bid for that funding, or would they have an allocation?
They have an allocation mechanism.
Thank you. And just a couple further points. I'm just wondering where the Early Years Change Fund comes into play with regard to this.
The Early Years Change Fund, as I think was alluded to in the letter from the Minister, the element that relates to the provision of childcare for 2-year-olds is being transferred across into the overall envelope for early learning and childcare as we go forward in future years.
Okay, well, thank you for providing that clarification. Just one last question, you'd be pleased to hear, is I'm just wondering what further detailed work will be carried out to flesh out the resource implications of the bill. You've talked about reviews and the evidence you've given to us, but it's just about ongoing work to ensure that we hone down some of these kind of figures prior to implementation, so we get a much more accurate reflection of what the costs will be from 2016.
I think the first thing to say to that is very often it's easiest or easier to come up with more accurate estimates of what provisions will cost once the detail is clear. And this is one of the issues as we develop the bill, that people have said they need more clarity and clarification on what this will mean in practice. And so one of the processes we're going through at the moment is thinking about what will go in secondary legislation that will flesh out what the actual requirements will be. And on the basis of that, we will be continuing to discuss with all the stakeholders who are affected by this what that will mean in terms of resourcing for them.
It'll be different for different parts of the bill. In GERFEC, there's already a program board which has an active kind of monitoring and engagement work already underway, and that will continue to look at the, I guess you might say the implementation requirements and any resource requirements going forward from the bill. With regard to early learning and childcare, a lot of that will come through through I guess the hub of COSLA, but there'll be a lot of discussions that are going on between the relevant teams in the Scottish Government and COSLA, not least on issues like distribution, which you've raised, but also with the NDNA and other key players as well about what the funding requirements, how they may start to look over time. And then clearly with the looked after children, there will have to be a lot of engagement, again, possibly through, well, definitely through COSLA and through ADSW, but also I think with some of the key stakeholders who have actively engaged in terms of the issues that are involved with regard to taking forward things like the kinship care order through care and aftercare to see what that might start to look like in practice, not least as part of the development of secondary legislation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Bill team for their robust responses to some of our questions. I'd like to thank colleagues around the table for their questions. At the start of the meeting, the committee agreed to take the next item in private. I therefore close the public part of the meeting. I'll have a 2-minute recess.